He was 12 years old when he walked behind his mother's coffin. This is the foundational image the British public has of him, the one that has shaped every subsequent assessment of his life. The photograph that appeared on the front pages of every newspaper in the country on the 7th of September, 1997. The small boy in the dark suit, the slightly larger brother walking beside him, the grandfather, the father, the uncle, the boy. 5 male figures of the British royal family walking the long mile from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey, while 1 million people stood silently along the route and several billion people watched on television around the world. The boy was Harry. He was 12. The mother whose coffin he was walking behind was Diana, Princess of Wales, who had died 7 days earlier in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. The image has not left the British public's understanding of him. It has not, by every available indication, fully left his own internal experience either. The walk has been one of the recurring subjects of his adult interviews. He has spoken about it multiple times across the past 2 decades. He has expressed in various forms his retrospective view that the institutional decision to require the walk was wrong. The decision had been made by senior figures of the royal family in consultation with Earl Spencer, his maternal uncle, in the days between Diana's death and her funeral. The decision had been controversial at the time. It has been more controversial in retrospect. The 2 boys who walked behind their mother's coffin were, by every contemporary assessment, performing an institutional duty that no one had asked whether they wanted to perform. This is one picture of Harry. It is the picture that his defenders return to when they want to explain his subsequent adult conduct. The traumatized child who lost his mother. The boy who was required to perform institutional grief in front of the largest television audience in modern history. The young man who was raised inside the institution that his mother had publicly fought against, whose mother had told him personally, by his own subsequent account, that the institution would eventually destroy her too. The figure whose entire adult life can be read, through one available frame, as the working out of the trauma that began on the 31st of August 1997, and that has, by his own account, never fully resolved. There are other pictures. In January 2005, 20 years old, he attended a costume party with the theme Native and Colonial. He wore an Afrika Korps uniform with a swastika armband. The photograph appeared on the front page of The Sun 2 weeks before Holocaust Memorial Day. In January 2009, 24 years old, footage emerged of him filming his fellow officer cadets at Sandhurst 3 years earlier. In the footage, he turned the camera on Officer Cadet Ahmed Raza Khan and identified him as our little Paki friend. He turned the camera in a separate clip on a white cadet wearing camouflage netting and told him, "You look like a raghead." In August 2012, 27 years old, photographs emerged of him playing strip billiards in a Las Vegas hotel suite. He was naked. The photographs were taken by women who had been in his suite at his invitation. The photographs were sold to TMZ and ran on the front pages of newspapers around the world. Before diving deeper on that, consider subscribing our channel and push the bell icon so you get all the updates about our channel. In January 2023, 38 years old, he published a memoir in which he admitted to using cocaine in his teens, described killing 25 Taliban combatants in Afghanistan as removing chess pieces from a board, and alleged that his elder brother William had grabbed him by the collar at Nottingham Cottage in 2019, ripped his necklace and knocked him to the floor onto a dog's bowl that had broken under his back. These are the documented incidents. There are others. There are the various forms of family rupture that have, since 2020, defined his estrangement from the institution he was born into. There are the legal proceedings against the British tabloids that have, across the years since 2019, occupied substantial portions of his adult attention. There are the continuing public statements, the documentary series, the various forms of media production that have, in their cumulative effect, made him one of the most documented members of his generation of the British royal family. This documentary is about the accumulated pattern. It is about the man whose life the British public has been examining in pieces for 40 years, and whose pattern, when assembled, reveals something more complicated than either his defenders or his critics have been able to fully accommodate. The traumatized child of Diana is real. The man who used the slur is real. The Afghanistan veteran is real. The Vegas figure is real. The husband and father building a life in California is real. They are all real. They are all him. The historical record now holds the pattern that has been emerging across his entire visible life. The title of this documentary is The Framing the British Press Has, in various forms, applied to him across the years. The framing is not the whole truth. No single framing is. The framing is, however, one of the available frames through which his documented adult conduct can be examined. The examination is the work this documentary will be conducting across the next 2¾ hours. The pattern the examination produces is the pattern that, until the publication of Spare in January 2023, the British royal family had been institutionally maintaining the silence about. The silence broke. The pattern is now visible. This documentary is about what the pattern actually is. He was born on the 15th of September 1984 at St Mary's Hospital, Paddington, London. His mother was Diana, Princess of Wales, 23 years old, 3 years into her marriage, 2 years past the birth of her elder son William, and 5 years into the public role that had, by 1984, already made her the most photographed woman in the world. His father was Charles, Prince of Wales, 35 years old, the heir to the British throne, the institutional figure whose marriage to Diana had been, by 1984, already showing the strains that would eventually produce the public collapse of the partnership a decade later. The household into which Harry was born was, by every account from those who observed it at close range across his earliest years, structurally fractured. The marriage was not happy. Diana had registered by 1984 that her husband's emotional life remained substantially attached to Camilla Parker Bowles, the woman he had been involved with before his marriage and would, by various subsequent revelations, continue to be involved with across substantial portions of the marriage to Diana. The institutional facade of the marriage was being maintained. The actual partnership had begun to come apart. What this meant for the new infant was a specific household environment. The mother who had produced him was, by every contemporary indication, struggling with depression, with bulimia, with the various forms of psychological strain that the conditions of her marriage and her institutional position had produced in her. The father was emotionally absent in the ways that Charles was emotionally absent, preoccupied with his own concerns, institutionally distant, not the kind of presence that his children's developmental needs required. The household around them was staffed by nannies, household personnel, and the institutional figures who managed the daily operations of senior royal residences in the period. The structural framework of his birth, however, was the framework that the title of this part identifies. He was the spare. The phrase is the institutional shorthand for the second son of the heir to the British throne. The spare exists in the institutional logic of the British monarchy for a specific purpose. The spare guarantees the succession against catastrophe affecting the heir. The spare is the backup. The spare's existence has institutional value. The spare's particular development as a person has, by the framework's traditional logic, considerably less institutional value than the heir's development. This was the framework Harry was born into. His brother William, born 2 years and 2 months earlier on the 21st of June 1982, was the heir. The household had been organized around William's eventual succession from the moment of his birth. The institutional resources that the family directed toward the production of the future king had been directed at William. Harry, when he arrived in 1984, was received into the household as the figure whose institutional purpose was to be the spare. What this meant in the practical reality of his upbringing was a different version of the framework that previous generations of British royal younger sons had absorbed. Harry would be raised. He would be educated. He would be prepared for the kind of senior royal life that British younger sons typically occupied. The patronages, the military service, the supporting institutional duties that allowed the heir to focus on his own preparation. The framework had been operating for generations. It had produced in its various applications figures like Andrew, the spare to Charles. It had produced further back the figures who had occupied the second son position across the long history of the British royal family. What it did not in its institutional logic prepare Harry for was the particular conditions his actual childhood would impose on him. The framework had assumed in its traditional operations a certain kind of stable family environment around the second son. The family environment Harry was born into was not stable. The marriage was failing, the mother was unwell, the father was distant, the press attention on the family was unprecedented. The framework's traditional assumptions about what kind of household the spare would be raised in had been substantially invalidated by the actual conditions of the late 20th century British royal family. Harry absorbed these conditions across his earliest years. The biographical record we have access to includes various accounts from those who observed him as a small child. He was, by every account, a charming child. He had inherited from his mother some specific qualities, the warmth, the spontaneity, the capacity for connection with strangers that Diana had also possessed. He had also inherited by various assessments some of his mother's emotional volatility, the tendency towards strong feeling, the capacity for both deep attachment and visible distress that had defined Diana's own emotional presentation. The differential between him and William was visible from his earliest years. William was, by every account, the more institutionally focused child. He had been formed by his earlier birth and by his structural position as the heir into the kind of child who absorbed the institution's expectations with the kind of seriousness his position required. Harry was different. Harry was, in his early years, the funnier child, the more spontaneous one, the brother whose particular charm produced the kind of active engagement that William's more reserved presentation did not always produce. The differential would, across the decades that followed, define many dimensions of the relationship between the two brothers. William was the heir, Harry was the spare. The framework's logic about what each of them should be was the framework that operated on each of them with different particular pressures. The cumulative effect of the differential pressures would be visible, by their late 30s, in the very different lives the two brothers were leading. His relationship with his mother, across the early years before her death, was substantially the warmest dimension of his childhood. Diana had, by every account, particularly engaged with her younger son. She had registered the institutional pressure on William and had attempted, in her parenting, to compensate for the pressure with the kind of warm engagement that her own temperament made available. Harry, who was less constrained by the institutional pressure that William was absorbing, was more available to receive the warmth that Diana could provide. The mother-son bond that developed between Diana and Harry across his early years was, by every account, exceptionally close. It was also, by the structural conditions of Diana's life, conducted under increasing pressure as Harry's childhood progressed. By 1992, when Harry was 8, Diana and Charles had formally separated. The separation had not been announced as a divorce. That would not come until 1996. But the separation had effectively ended the marriage in any practical sense. The two boys were now living in different proportions with each parent. They spent time at Kensington Palace with Diana. They spent time at Highgrove and other residences with Charles. The institutional framework around the marriage's collapse had organized itself in the conventional ways that aristocratic British divorces of the period organized themselves. The press attention on Diana, across the period of the separation and into the years that followed, was unprecedented. She was the most photographed woman in the world. The British tabloid press, in particular, had developed across the 1980s and into the 1990s a relationship with her that combined intensive coverage with the kind of intrusive surveillance that contemporary privacy expectations would consider unacceptable. Diana was photographed everywhere. Her movements were tracked. Her private life was the subject of continuous tabloid speculation. The pressure on her had become, by the mid-1990s, one of the principal features of her daily existence. Harry observed this. He observed it in the particular ways that small children observe what their parents are absorbing. He registered, by every available account from his subsequent statements about the period, that his mother was being chased by photographers. He registered that the chasing was producing distress in her. He registered, in the small daily reality of his life with her, that the press was the principal external pressure on the family environment he was operating in. The registration would, in his subsequent adult life, produce one of the foundational features of his own institutional posture. He would absorb from his mother's experience a specific hostility toward the British tabloid press that he would carry into his adult life and that would, in various forms, define his subsequent legal and public conduct toward the institution he had identified as responsible for his mother's distress. His relationship with his father across these years was different. Charles was by every account less emotionally available than Diana. He was preoccupied with his own concerns. He was institutionally focused in the ways that his framework-imposed upbringing had taught him to be. He was, in the practical reality of his children's daily lives, less present than their mother had been even in her difficult periods. The relationship between Charles and Harry across the early years was correct rather than warm. The institutional codes that Charles had absorbed from his own upbringing required correctness. They did not, in their traditional operations, require warmth. Harry received what Charles was capable of providing, which was the institutional version of paternal engagement that the framework had taught Charles to provide. His relationship with William across these years was by every account close. The two brothers had been in their early childhood the principal emotional supports for each other across the difficulties of their parents' marriage. They were close in age, they shared the household conditions. They had been in the traditional pattern of brothers in difficult families, the figures who had developed the kind of mutual support that their parents' fractured relationship had not been able to provide. The closeness would be, across the decades that followed, one of the durable features of their early life. It would also eventually be the closeness that the events of their adult lives would put under the kind of pressure that closeness sometimes does not survive. By the summer of 1997, when Harry was 12, the family conditions had stabilized in a particular configuration. Diana had been formally divorced from Charles for slightly over a year. The divorce had been finalized on the 28th of August, 1996. She was conducting her post-divorce life with the kind of public visibility her position made unavoidable. She was involved with Dodi Fayed, the son of the Egyptian businessman Mohammed Al-Fayed, who owned Harrods. The relationship had been the subject of intense press attention across the summer of 1997. The two boys were spending the summer in the conventional pattern that the post-divorce arrangements had established. Periods with each parent, the kind of summer that British children of separated parents typically experienced. The boys were at Balmoral with Charles and the rest of the senior royal family in late August 1997. Diana was on holiday with Dodi Fayed in the south of France, then in Paris. The two phases of their summer were, in the practical reality, separate. The boys were with their father. Their mother was elsewhere. The arrangement had been the conventional one. The arrangement was about to be permanently disrupted by what would happen on the night of the 30th of August into the early hours of the 31st. The framework that Harry had been formed into across his first 12 years had absorbed substantial pressures already. The marriage's collapse, the separations, the press attention, the mother's documented distress, the institutional conditions of his birth as the spare. He had absorbed all of these. He had developed by 12 into a child whose internal architecture was already, by every retrospective assessment, more complicated than the traditional framework had been organized to accommodate. He had been, even before his mother's death, a child whose particular trauma exposure had been substantial. What was about to happen would multiply the trauma to a degree that no traditional institutional framework was equipped to address. The death that occurred on the 31st of August would not, in the years that followed, be processed through any kind of comprehensive psychological intervention by the institution responsible for his upbringing. The institution would, in its traditional operations, expect Harry to absorb the death the way the institution had been organized to absorb such events. The expectation would be substantially miscalibrated to what the death actually did to him. The miscalibration would produce, across the decades that followed, the cumulative damage that his subsequent adult conduct would in various forms express. In the part that follows, we move to the death itself and to the years that followed. The night of the 30th of August. The crash in the Ponte Lalama tunnel, the funeral, the walk behind the coffin, the years of his adolescence inside the institution that had not in any institutional sense been organized to address what his mother's death had imposed on him, because the formation that Harry would carry into his adult life was substantially completed in the years between 1997 and 2002. The boy who emerged from those years was the boy who would at 16 begin the documented adult conduct that the rest of this documentary will examine. The boy who emerged was not, by any reasonable assessment, the boy who had walked into 1997. The boy who walked into 1997 had been, with all his complications, the small child of a difficult marriage. The boy who emerged from 2002 was the figure whose adult life would, across the next 2 decades, produce the pattern of documented incidents that this documentary has been built to examine. The events of the night of the 30th of August, 1997, into the early hours of the 31st, have been documented across thousands of pages of subsequent investigation, inquest, and biographical reconstruction. The factual sequence is now substantially established. Diana, Princess of Wales, was in Paris with Dodi Fayed. They had dined at the Ritz Hotel that evening. They had attempted after dinner to leave the hotel via a rear entrance to evade the photographers who had been pursuing them throughout the day. The Mercedes-Benz S-Class they were traveling in was driven by Henri Paul, a security officer at the Ritz. The car entered the Pont de l'Alma underpass at high speed. At approximately 12:23 in the early morning of the 31st of August, the car struck a pillar in the underpass and came to a violent stop against the wall. Henri Paul died at the scene. Dodi Fayed died at the scene. Diana was extracted from the wreckage alive but with severe internal injuries. She was transferred to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital. The medical teams attempted, across the following hours, to address her injuries. The injuries were beyond what the medical resources available could address. She was pronounced dead at 4 o'clock in the morning, Paris time, on the 31st of August, 1997. Harry was at Balmoral. He was 12 years old. The senior royal family was in residence at the Scottish estate that the family used for its summer holidays. Charles was there. William was there. The Queen, Prince Philip, and the various other senior figures of the family were there. The household was operating on the conventional schedule that Balmoral typically operated on in late August. The news of the crash reached Balmoral in the early hours. The institutional decisions about how the news would be communicated to the boys were made by the senior figures of the family in consultation with Charles. The decisions, by every account that has been preserved from those who were present, were made with the kind of careful consideration that the gravity of the situation required. Charles was the figure who would tell the boys. He would do so when they woke. He would tell them together. The boys would then absorb the news in the conditions that Balmoral provided. What the institution did not do, in the immediate aftermath of the death, was modify its operational rhythms in any visible way. The Queen, by various accounts, made the decision that the boys should remain at Balmoral rather than being moved to London. The decision had institutional logic. Balmoral was private, it was protected from the press attention that London would have produced. The boys would have access to the kind of family-based support that the senior royal residence could provide. The decision also had a different dimension. The institution was responding to the death of one of its members through the institutional codes the framework had developed across generations. The codes did not include the kind of direct emotional intervention that contemporary psychological understanding would consider appropriate for two boys who had just lost their mother. The codes included continuation. The institution would continue. The boys would, by the codes, be expected to continue with it. This is the foundational structural fact about how the institution responded to the death. The response was institutional. The response was not in any significant sense calibrated to what the boys actually needed. The framework that had operated on the senior royal family across generations had not been organized to accommodate the kind of emotional crisis that a sudden parental death in a public family produced. The framework would, across the days and years that followed, apply itself to the boys as the framework had been organized to apply itself. The application would produce in both boys, but particularly in Harry, the cumulative damage that the absence of more adequate intervention had specifically permitted. The senior royal family remained at Balmoral for several days after the death. The decision attracted significant criticism from the British public, who were experiencing the death as a national event and who expected the royal family to be visibly present in London during the period of public mourning. The criticism intensified across the days that followed. By the 4th of September, the public pressure had become substantial enough that the Queen made the institutional decision to return to London earlier than the original Balmoral schedule had planned. The family returned. The Queen made the televised address to the nation that the institutional moment had come to require. The institutional response to the public pressure was completed in the days before the funeral. The funeral was held on the 6th of September 1997 at Westminster Abbey. The arrangements had been the subject of intensive institutional negotiation across the preceding week. The walk from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey, the procession behind the coffin, had been one of the specific institutional decisions that produced subsequent retrospective examination. The decision had been made by the senior royal family in consultation with Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, who would be one of the figures walking behind the coffin alongside the male royal family members. The 5 figures who walked were Charles, William, Earl Spencer, Prince Philip, and Harry. The decision that the boys would walk had not been entirely the decision of the senior royal family. By various accounts that have been preserved from those involved in the decision, Prince Philip had been the figure who had specifically encouraged the boys to participate in the walk. He had told them, in various reconstructions of the conversation, that he would walk with them, and that they should consider doing it for their mother. The boys walked. The mile from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey was conducted in front of an estimated 1 million people standing in silence along the route. The walk was broadcast live to an estimated global audience of 2.5 billion. The image of the small boys behind the coffin became one of the iconic images of the late 20th century. The image has remained, across the subsequent 3 decades, one of the foundational images that the British public has of both boys. What the boys experienced during the walk has been the subject of various subsequent reconstructions. Both Harry and William have spoken about the walk in subsequent interviews. Both have described the experience as substantially traumatic. Harry, in particular, has described in Spare and in earlier interviews the dissociative quality of the experience, the sense of being outside himself, the inability to fully process what was happening, the feeling that he was performing an institutional duty without being able to register the personal grief the duty was supposed to be expressing. Harry was 12 years old. The expectation that a 12-year-old child would be able to perform institutional grief in front of a global audience immediately after losing his mother while walking behind her coffin for over a mile would, by any contemporary psychological assessment, be considered an institutionally inappropriate expectation. The expectation was the institutional convention. The convention had been the convention. The boys had been required to absorb the convention. The cost of the absorption would, in Harry's case, become one of the recurring features of his subsequent adult life. Following the funeral, the boys returned to the conditions of their pre-death life. Charles took primary responsibility for them in the immediate aftermath. The boys went to Highgrove for periods. They returned to school in due course, William to Eton, Harry to Ludgrove, the preparatory school he had been attending. The institutional response to the death, in its operational dimensions, was the response that the framework had been organized to produce. The boys would be returned to their schools. The schools would continue their education. The framework would continue. What the framework did not provide, by every account that has been preserved from the period and from Harry's subsequent reflections on it, was the kind of comprehensive psychological intervention that the death's trauma required. The boys were not, in any institutional sense, given access to professional grief counseling. Their school environments were expected to absorb their continued education without significant modification to accommodate what had happened. The senior royal family's expectations of them were not modified. They were expected by the framework to absorb the death and continue. This was the standard institutional response that the framework had been organized to produce. Royal children, in the framework's traditional operations, had been expected to absorb personal losses through institutional discipline rather than through professional psychological intervention. The framework had not been updated by 1997 to accommodate contemporary psychological understanding of childhood trauma. The framework operated on its traditional logic. The boys absorbed the death through the framework's traditional mechanisms, which were substantially inadequate to what the death had done to them. Harry has spoken extensively about this period in his subsequent adult interviews. The picture he has produced is consistent across his various accounts. He did not, by his own description, process the death of his mother in any meaningful sense across the years that followed. He buried it. He continued with his life. He performed the institutional duties his position required. He returned to school. He completed his education. He went to Sandhurst. He served in Afghanistan. The death remained, by his own account, substantially unprocessed across approximately the next 20 years of his life. What this meant in the practical reality of his adolescence and early adulthood was that the cumulative emotional damage of the death was, throughout this period, operating internally without producing the kind of visible distress that would have triggered institutional intervention. The damage was real. The damage was producing effects on his psychological development. The effects were not, however, visible enough to the institution to require modification of the framework's operations. The framework continued. Harry continued inside it. The cumulative damage accumulated. By 2002, when Harry was 16, the first documented behavioral consequences of his unprocessed grief began to emerge in publicly visible ways. He admitted in that year to having used cannabis and to having engaged in underage drinking. The admission was made privately to his father after the British press had begun to develop the story. Charles's response was to send Harry to the Phoenix House Drug Rehabilitation Center for a day. The intervention was, by the standards of contemporary substance abuse treatment, substantially inadequate. A single day at a rehabilitation facility was not, by any reasonable assessment, the kind of intervention that an adolescent who had begun using drugs in the wake of unprocessed maternal trauma actually required. The intervention was the institutional response. The institutional response was framed as adequate. The framework continued. What the institutional response had not addressed in any meaningful way was the underlying psychological condition that had produced the drug use. Harry had been using drugs because he was an adolescent boy whose mother had died traumatically when he was 12, and whose subsequent grief had not been institutionally processed. The drugs were the symptom. The unprocessed grief was the underlying condition. The institutional response had addressed the symptom briefly and inadequately and had not in any sense addressed the underlying condition. The framework's traditional logic about substance abuse, that the substance abuse was the problem and that the appropriate response was the punishment of the substance abuse, had been applied to a case where the framework's traditional logic was substantially miscalibrated to what was actually happening to the adolescent involved. The miscalibration would, across the decades that followed, define many of the institutional responses to Harry's documented behavior. The behavior would emerge in various forms. The institution would respond in various forms to the surface manifestations. The underlying psychological condition that was producing the behavior would not, until Harry himself began to address it through professional therapy in his 30s, be the focus of any institutional intervention. The framework would continue. Harry would continue inside it. The cumulative damage would continue to accumulate, expressing itself in different forms across the years. This is the foundational fact that the rest of this documentary's examination of his adult conduct has to hold alongside the examination of the conduct itself. The documented incidents that we will examine, the Nazi uniform, the slur, the Vegas photographs, the various other features of his pattern, were the surface manifestations of a deeper condition that the institution had specifically not been organized to address. The institution was responsible for producing the conditions in which the unprocessed grief had been allowed to accumulate. Harry was responsible for the specific choices he made within those conditions. Both responsibilities are real, neither cancels the other. The accumulated pattern of his documented adult conduct was the product of both. The years between 1997 and 2002 also produced in Harry the foundational hostility toward the British tabloid press that would define many dimensions of his subsequent adult life. He had registered, across the period before his mother's death, that the British tabloids were pursuing his mother. He had registered in the immediate aftermath of the crash that the photographers who had been chasing the Mercedes through the streets of Paris were among the institutional figures whose conduct had contributed to the conditions that produced the crash. The photographers had been there. The photographers had continued to take pictures of the crash scene. The photographers had, by various contemporary accounts, attempted to photograph the dying Diana inside the wrecked car before they were prevented from doing so by emergency responders. Whether the photographers had directly caused the crash has been the subject of substantial subsequent investigation. The investigations have not, in any conclusive sense, identified the photographers as the proximate cause. The proximate cause was Henry Paul's intoxication and excessive speed. The photographers were a contributing factor. The speed at which the Mercedes was traveling had been an attempt to evade them, but the legal responsibility for the crash had not, by any subsequent legal determination, been assigned to them. For Harry, however, the legal responsibility was a different question from the moral responsibility. The photographers had been there. The photographers had been pursuing his mother. The photographers had contributed by their pursuit to the conditions in which she had died. The British tabloid press, more broadly, had been the institutional figure whose behaviour had produced the pursuit. Harry held the British tabloid press responsible for his mother's death. He held them responsible across his subsequent adult life, with a consistency and an intensity that has, in various forms, defined his subsequent legal and public conduct. The framework had not, in its traditional operations, prepared the British royal family for the kind of antagonism toward the tabloid press that Harry would eventually develop. The traditional institutional response to tabloid coverage had been a complicated combination of cooperation, manipulation, and tolerance. Senior royals had, across the late 20th century, developed working arrangements with the tabloid press that allowed both sides to extract value from the relationship. The arrangements were not friendships. The arrangements were institutional accommodations that recognized the practical reality that the tabloid press was an unavoidable feature of senior royal public life, and that the royals' interests were generally served by managing the relationship rather than antagonizing it. Harry would not, across his subsequent adult life, accept this framework. He would identify the tabloid press as the institutional figure responsible for his mother's death, and would conduct his subsequent relationship with the press accordingly. The conduct would eventually produce the various legal proceedings he has filed against the British tabloids across the years since 2019. The proceedings would, in their cumulative effect, modify the institutional framework that had operated for generations between the royal family and the tabloid press. Harry's particular hostility toward the press had its foundations in the period we are now examining, the years between his mother's death and his own emergence into the documented adult conduct that the rest of this documentary will examine. By 2002, Harry was 16. He had been formed by the conditions of his early life. The formation had included the difficult marriage of his parents, the death of his mother, the institutional response that had not adequately addressed the death's trauma, the foundational hostility toward the tabloid press that the period had produced. He was about to enter the years of his late adolescence and early adulthood, the years that would produce the documented incidents that the public would, across the next decade, increasingly identify as the pattern that the title of this documentary refers to. The documented incidents would emerge in particular sequence: the cannabis admission of 2002, the Nazi uniform of January 2005, the Sandhurst slur footage of 2006 leaked in 2009, the Las Vegas photographs of August 2012. Each incident would, in its own specific circumstances, be the surface manifestation of the deeper condition we have been examining in this part. Each incident would produce institutional responses. The institutional responses would address the surface manifestations without addressing the underlying condition. The pattern would continue. What would also continue across these years was Harry's own development as a person. He was not, in any simple sense, only the product of his trauma. He was also a young man with his own capacity for choice, his own moral agency, his own responsibility for the conduct he produced. The documented incidents we will examine were not simply the consequences of his unprocessed grief, they were also the choices he made. The choices were his. The responsibility for the choices was his. The framework's failure to provide him with adequate institutional support did not in itself absolve him of the moral responsibility for what he chose to do. This is the dimension of his case that the more sympathetic accounts of his life have sometimes had difficulty fully accommodating. Harry was a victim of institutional inadequacy. Harry was also responsible for his own conduct. Both are true. The documented incidents would reveal the second dimension as starkly as the first. The slur he used was a slur he chose to use. The Nazi uniform he wore was a uniform he chose to wear. The Las Vegas conduct was conduct he engaged in. The institutional inadequacy that had produced him had also been combined with his own choices about what kind of person he would be. The combination produced the pattern we will examine. In the part that follows, we move to the years at Eton and to the first publicly documented scandals of his late adolescence: the 2002 cannabis admission, the Phoenix House visit. The years that followed at Eton, where his developing temperament was being formed inside the institutional environment that British upper-class boys' education provided. The January 2005 Nazi uniform incident, the costume choice, the photograph, the front page of The Sun, the apology, the institutional handling, the pattern that the public was beginning to recognize, the framework that was managing the pattern through the kind of institutional silences and brief acknowledgements that the framework had been organized to produce when senior royal conduct produced public scandals. Because by 2005 the pattern had begun to become visible. The British public had begun to develop, by Harry's 20th year, the working assessment that he was a particular kind of figure whose conduct fit a particular pattern. The assessment was not yet fully crystallized. The Vegas photographs were still 7 years away. The Sandhurst footage had been recorded but not yet leaked, but the foundations of the public's eventual understanding of him were being laid. The Nazi uniform incident in particular would produce the kind of public scandal that the British media of the period would not, despite the institutional management, fully be able to absorb. The pattern was emerging. The next part will examine how the emergence proceeded. He arrived at Eton in September 1998. He was 13 years old. The arrival had occurred just over a year after his mother's death. The institutional decision that he would attend Eton had been made before the death. Both boys had been on the institutional path that British upper-class male education traditionally followed, and Eton had been the destination the family had selected. The decision had not been modified by the death. The framework's traditional logic had treated the death as an event the boys would absorb and continue past, and the Eton arrangement had proceeded on the original schedule. Eton College in 1998 was the institutional environment that British upper-class boys had been being formed in for over 5.5 centuries. The school had been founded by Henry VI in 1440. Its institutional culture had developed across the subsequent centuries into the particular form that British boarding school culture had reached by the late 20th century. The form included academic rigor, athletic emphasis, a complicated internal hierarchy of seniority and house affiliations, and the expectation that students would absorb a specific institutional discipline that would shape them into the kind of adults that British upper-class life required. Harry's experience at Eton was, by every account from his subsequent reflections on it, mixed. He was not academically distinguished. His tutors observed across his years at the school that he found the academic work difficult in ways that William, who had attended Eton ahead of him, had not. The difficulty was not, by any contemporary assessment, a function of low intelligence. It was a function of the various features of his particular character, the dyslexia that some subsequent accounts have suggested he may have had, the unprocessed grief that was operating internally without producing the kind of academic engagement his work required, the temperamental restlessness that Eton's structured academic environment did not particularly accommodate. He was, however, social. He had what his contemporaries described as the kind of charm that produced active engagement with both his peers and the school's adult figures. He was popular within his house. He developed friendships with various boys whose families occupied the same social circles his own family operated within. He participated in the various extracurricular activities that Eton's culture permitted: sports, the cadet corps, the small social activities that Eton boys engaged in across their 5 years of residence at the school. What Eton did not in any institutional sense provide him with was the kind of psychological intervention that his unprocessed grief required. The school operated on the conventional logic of the period, which held that boarding school environments produced toughening rather than therapeutic engagement. Harry was at Eton to be educated and to be formed. He was not at Eton to be psychologically supported through his mother's death. The school's institutional culture had not been organized to provide that kind of support, and the support was not provided. The drug use began, by his own subsequent accounts, in the period of his middle adolescence at Eton. He has described in various subsequent statements, including the spare memoir, the first instances of his drug use. The cannabis had been the first substance. He had been introduced to it by friends in the social circles he was operating within. The use had progressed from initial experimentation into more regular consumption across the years that followed. He had, by his 16th year, become a young man whose substance use had moved past the casual experimentation that British upper-class adolescents of the period commonly engaged in and into the more sustained pattern that produces institutional concern. Cocaine entered his use, by his own spare account, at age 17 during a hunting trip. The detail is preserved in the memoir. He was offered a line by someone in the social circles he was operating in. He took it. The cocaine became, across the period that followed, a feature of his social life in the various contexts where it was available. The use was not, by his own accounts, sustained in the way that produces clinical addiction. It was, however, sustained enough that by his late adolescence he was a young man whose substance use across multiple categories had become a feature of his social functioning. The cannabis use became publicly documented in early 2002, when Harry was 17. The documentation came through the British tabloid press, which had been investigating reports about Harry's conduct at the Rattlebone Inn, a pub near Highgrove where Harry and his friends had been drinking and, by various accounts, smoking cannabis. The reports reached Charles. Charles confronted Harry. Harry admitted to the conduct. The institutional response was the response we examined in the previous part. He was sent to the Phoenix House Drug Rehabilitation Center for a day. The Phoenix House visit has become one of the iconic small details of Harry's institutional management across his life. The visit was, in its institutional logic, designed to produce two outcomes. It would produce for Harry himself exposure to the consequences of serious drug addiction in the form of meetings with people whose lives had been substantially destroyed by their substance use. It would produce for the public the institutional acknowledgement that Charles had taken decisive action in response to his son's conduct. The two outcomes were the framework's standard response to substance issues in young royals: institutional acknowledgement, brief intervention, return to normal operations. What the Phoenix House visit did not produce by any subsequent assessment was meaningful modification of Harry's substance use. He continued to use cannabis. He would, by 2005 or 2006, begin using cocaine. The substance use would continue in various forms across substantial portions of his late adolescence and early adulthood. The institutional intervention had not addressed the underlying condition that was producing the use. The institutional intervention had addressed the public relations dimension of the issue. The framework had operated. The framework had not produced the substantive change that effective intervention would have required. The 2002 cannabis incident also produced the first public characterization of Harry as a particular kind of young royal. The British tabloids, in their coverage of the incident, began to develop the framing that would, across the subsequent decade, become the standard public characterization of him. He was, in the framing, the wild one. He was the partying brother. He was the figure whose conduct contrasted with the more institutionally disciplined William. The framing was the framework that British tabloid coverage of senior royal younger sons traditionally produced. The framing applied to Harry. The framing would, across the years that followed, become substantially more developed as additional incidents accumulated. The next major documented incident occurred in January 2005. Harry was 20 years old. He had completed his Eton education in 2003 and had taken a gap year that had included travel to Australia and Lesotho before he was scheduled to begin at Sandhurst Royal Military Academy. The gap year had concluded. He was preparing for Sandhurst. He was, by every account from those who observed him in the period, conducting the kind of social life that British upper-class 20-year-olds typically conducted. The various social events that the calendar of his class produced, the shooting parties, the country weekends, the costume parties. One such costume party was held in early January 2005 at the home of a friend in the Cotswolds. The party's theme was native and colonial. The theme itself, in retrospective examination, has attracted significant subsequent criticism. A costume party themed around the colonial period of British imperial history, requiring guests to dress as either natives or colonials, was not, by any reasonable contemporary assessment, an appropriate theme for a 2005 social event. The theme, however, was the theme. Harry had been invited. He had decided to attend. He had decided in selecting his costume to address the theme through a particular interpretation. The selection of the costume has been documented in two different versions across the subsequent years. The first version, the one that emerged in the immediate aftermath of the incident in 2005, suggested that Harry had selected the costume on his own, that he had, by his own initiative, chosen to attend the party in a Nazi uniform. This version of the story was the version that produced the initial scandal and that shaped the subsequent institutional response. The second version emerged in 2023 with the publication of Spare. In that version, Harry described the costume selection differently. He described having phoned William and Kate to ask for their input on the costume choice. He described having presented them with two options: a British pilot uniform and a sand-colored Nazi uniform with a swastika armband. He described that William and Kate had encouraged the Nazi uniform option. He described that he had then rented the Nazi uniform and gone to the party in it. The two versions are not in their factual elements fully reconcilable. The first version, which suggested that Harry had made the costume decision alone, was the version the institution had allowed to be the public account in 2005. The second version, which implicated William and Kate in the decision-making, was the version Harry produced 18 years later. The truth is probably some combination of the two. Harry probably did consult William and Kate, who probably did encourage the choice, but the final decision was his own and the responsibility for the choice was therefore his own. What is undisputed is what happened at the party itself. Harry attended in the Nazi Afrika Korps uniform. The uniform included the swastika armband. He was photographed at the party by other guests, drinking and socializing in the costume. The photographs were sold to the Sun tabloid newspaper. The Sun published the photographs on its front page on the 13th of January, 2005. The headline was "Harry the Nazi." The publication produced an immediate and substantial scandal. The scandal had several specific dimensions. The first was the costume itself. A senior member of the British royal family wearing a Nazi uniform with a swastika armband was, by every reasonable measure of the period, an unacceptable choice. The Nazi regime had been the principal antagonist of the British state in the Second World War. The royal family, Harry's grandmother in particular, who had served during the war, had been institutional figures of British wartime resistance. A grandson of the wartime queen wearing the uniform of the regime his grandmother's institution had been organized to defeat was in itself an institutional offense that the framework had not been organized to accommodate. The second dimension was the timing. The party had been held in early January 2005. The 27th of January 2005 was the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, which had been designated International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Harry had attended the party 2 weeks before this anniversary. The institutional context that any reasonable observer would have registered in choosing a costume for a January 2005 party included the approaching anniversary. Harry had not registered the context. He had selected the costume. The selection had occurred 2 weeks before the anniversary. The third dimension was Harry himself. He was, in 2005, approaching his entry to Sandhurst Royal Military Academy, where he would begin the military career that the framework had organized for him. The institution was preparing to send him into the British Armed Forces, which were continuing institutions of the same wartime British state that had defeated the Nazi regime. A future officer of the British Army wearing a Nazi uniform 2 weeks before Holocaust Remembrance Day was, in the institutional logic of his preparation for military service, an offence that some critics suggested should disqualify him from the army career he was about to begin. The institutional response was the standard response that the framework was organised to produce. Harry issued an apology through Clarence House. The apology was brief. "I am very sorry if I caused any offence or embarrassment to anyone. It was a poor choice of costume and I apologize." The phrasing was the institutional phrasing, the conditional "if I caused any offence" rather than the unconditional acknowledgement that the offence had been caused. The framing as a poor choice rather than as the more substantial moral failure that the choice represented. Charles took additional institutional action beyond the apology. He arranged for Harry to meet with the Chief Rabbi of Britain, Jonathan Sacks, who was the institutional figure whose engagement with the case the framework had identified as appropriate. The meeting occurred. The Chief Rabbi spoke with Harry about why the costume choice had been wrong. He explained, in the kind of patient pedagogical manner that his role required, the institutional and historical reasons why a swastika in 2005 could not be treated as merely a costume element. He also, by various subsequent accounts, granted Harry forgiveness for the offence, the institutional acknowledgement that the apology had been received and that the matter could now be considered closed. The institutional handling in its operational dimensions was completed within approximately a week of the Sun publication. The apology had been issued. The Chief Rabbi meeting had occurred. The Holocaust Remembrance Day on the 27th of January had passed without further incident. Harry's preparation for Sandhurst had continued. The framework had absorbed the scandal in the manner the framework was organized to absorb scandals. The matter had been closed. What the institutional handling had not addressed in any substantive sense was the underlying question of what the costume choice had revealed about Harry's actual character. The institution had treated the matter as a public relations issue requiring institutional management. The matter could also be treated as a moral issue requiring substantive examination. The substantive examination would have required asking what kind of 20-year-old man in January 2005 would select a Nazi uniform as a costume. What features of his moral education or his historical understanding had produced the conditions in which the choice had appeared to him as an acceptable option? The institution did not ask this question publicly. The question would have produced answers that the framework was not equipped to absorb. The framework had been organized to manage the surface manifestations of the conduct. The substantive examination of what the conduct revealed about the figure had been beyond the framework's institutional capacity. The substantive examination in retrospect produces specific answers. The Nazi uniform choice revealed several features of Harry's character at 20. It revealed insufficient historical education. He had been formed by the institutional educational culture of his class without absorbing in any meaningful sense the historical weight of the Nazi symbols he had selected. It revealed insufficient moral seriousness. He had treated the choice as a matter of party costume rather than as the morally significant act it actually was. It revealed insufficient judgment. He had not in his decision-making process registered the various dimensions of why the choice was inappropriate. It revealed more broadly the framework's specific failures with him as a moral agent. The framework had produced a young man who at 20 did not have the moral foundation that his position required. The producing was the framework's responsibility. The choice itself was Harry's. Both responsibilities are real. The framework had failed to give him what he needed. He had failed, with what he had been given, to make the choice that the moment had required. There is one further dimension of the Nazi uniform incident that the spare version of the story has made available to retrospective examination. If Harry's account in Spare is accurate, that William and Kate had encouraged the Nazi uniform choice when he consulted them, the incident reveals something specific about the institutional culture of the senior royal family in 2005. The two figures Harry had consulted had not in their consultation identified the Nazi uniform as an unacceptable choice. They had encouraged it. The encouragement was in itself a feature of the institutional culture that had produced all three of them. The culture had not in its operational reality been organized to produce the kind of moral seriousness that would have produced the alternative recommendation. The culture had produced figures who treated Nazi uniforms as acceptable costume options when consulted. This dimension of the incident has been the subject of subsequent retrospective examination. The questions it raises about the institutional culture of the royal family in 2005 are questions that the framework, in its traditional operations, was organized to keep contained. The publication of Spare in 2023 had partially broken the containment. The questions are now part of the documentary record. They cannot be definitively answered without further documentation, but they can be examined. What the incident finally revealed, in its accumulated significance, was the first substantial public scandal of Harry's adult life. He was 20 years old. He had produced a documented incident that the British public would carry in its working assessment of him for the rest of his life. The framework had managed the immediate consequences of the incident. The framework had not managed, and could not have managed, the cumulative effect that the incident would have on his subsequent public reputation. The incident would be cited in nearly every subsequent profile of Harry across the next 2 decades as one of the foundational items in his public record. The Vegas photographs of 2012 would refer back to it. The Sandhurst slur footage of 2009 would refer back to it. The various subsequent incidents would refer back to it. The Nazi uniform was the first major item in the accumulating pattern. The pattern had begun. The British public would, across the years that followed, watch the pattern develop. In the part that follows, we move to Sandhurst and to the years of his military career. The 2005 entry to Sandhurst Royal Military Academy. The 2006 video footage that would, 3 years later, produce the documented racial slurs that constitute one of the most serious items in his pattern. The Afghanistan tours and the genuine military service he produced. The 2023 spare admissions about the 25 Taliban deaths and the chess pieces framing the complicated dimension of his military career, the genuine service he provided alongside the documented conduct that the service contained. Both dimensions are real. The next part will examine how they operated together across the years of his military life. He arrived at Sandhurst on the 8th of May 2005, 4 months after the Nazi uniform incident. He was 20 years old. The Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst was the institutional environment in which the British Army produced its officers. The training program was approximately 1 year in duration. It produced across that year the kind of intensive institutional formation that the British Army required of its commissioned officers: the physical conditioning, the tactical training, the leadership development, the small accumulated disciplines that turned civilian recruits into the figures the Army would commission as second lieutenants at the program's conclusion. Harry's progression through Sandhurst was, by every account from those who observed him during the period, more successful than his Eton experience had been. The institutional culture of military training had specific features that suited his temperament in ways the academic culture of Eton had not. The training was physical. The training was practical. The training had clear objectives that could be achieved through measurable performance rather than through the more diffuse academic engagement that Eton had required. Harry, by every account, performed adequately at Sandhurst. He passed the program. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Blues and Royals, one of the senior cavalry regiments of the British Army, in April 2006. What he had also produced during the Sandhurst year, however, was the documentary record that would, 3 years later in January 2009, produce one of the most serious documented incidents of his adult life. The video footage was recorded by Harry himself across various points in 2006. He had been filming his fellow officer cadets and various incidents from his training experience. The footage was, by its character, the kind of casual personal documentation that young people of his generation had begun producing as small video cameras and the early forms of personal digital recording had become available. The footage was not intended for public release. It had been recorded for Harry's own personal archives. It had been preserved on personal storage that, at some point in the period between 2006 and 2009, had been accessed by figures who had then made the footage available to News of the World. The exact circumstances by which the footage reached News of the World have not been definitively documented. The newspaper, when it published the footage in January 2009, did not disclose its sources. The subsequent phone hacking scandal that engulfed News of the World in 2011 has provided some context for how the British tabloid press of the period had been obtaining material that was not intended for public release. The footage may have been obtained through one of the various extra-legal means that the newspaper's investigative practices included. It may have been obtained through more conventional means, a friend or acquaintance of Harry's who had been given access to it and had subsequently sold it. The exact source has not been established. What the footage contained was specific. In one segment, Harry was filming his fellow officer cadets at an airport, where they were waiting for a flight to a training exercise in Cyprus. He turned the camera on Officer Cadet Ahmed Raza Khan, a Pakistani-British member of his platoon. Khan would, by the time of the footage's eventual publication in 2009, have completed his Sandhurst training, graduated as the recipient of the Academy's Sword of Honour for being the best graduate of his year, and gone on to a distinguished military career that would include being commended for bravery during an ambush in which he was shot but continued fighting. In 2006, however, when the footage was recorded, Khan was a fellow cadet whose principal characteristic in Harry's narrative voiceover was his ethnicity. Harry's voiceover on the footage as Khan was being filmed was preserved in the News of the World publication and has been quoted across every subsequent examination of the case. Anyone else here? Our little Paki friend Ahmed. The slur was specific. The word Paki was in 2006 and continues in 2026, a derogatory term used in British English to refer to people of Pakistani or broader South Asian origin. The word had been the subject of significant public discourse across the previous decades about its specifically racist character. The word's use in the period had been substantially eliminated from acceptable British public discourse. Its use by senior figures was the kind of conduct that produced institutional consequences when it became public. Its use by a senior member of the royal family on video about a fellow officer cadet was conduct that fell well outside what the framework's institutional codes could accommodate. The footage also contained a second documented incident. In a separate segment, Harry was filming a night exercise in Cyprus during the same training period. He turned the camera on a white officer cadet who was wearing camouflage netting over his head. Harry's voiceover addressing the cadet was preserved as, "Fuck me, Dan, you look like a raghead." The slur was, again, specific. The word raghead was a derogatory term used to refer to people from the Middle East, typically Arabs, sometimes more broadly Muslims. The word had been particularly associated in British military culture of the post-2003 Iraq War period, with the kind of dehumanizing language that British soldiers had sometimes used about the populations of the countries they had been deployed to. The words used by Harry even toward a white cadet whose appearance happened to resemble what Harry had been trained to identify as a raghead was the kind of casual deployment of the term that revealed how the term was operating in his vocabulary. Just a thing come into my mind. Tell us in the comments where you are from. Also, if you like this documentary, please consider subscribing. The footage was published by News of the World on the 11th of January, 2009, 3 years after the recording. The publication produced an immediate and substantial public response. The response had several specific dimensions. The first was political. The Prime Minister Gordon Brown, speaking to GMTV television on the 12th of January, characterized the comments as unacceptable and as having no part in our life. The leader of the Conservative Party, David Cameron, speaking separately, said the comments were obviously a completely unacceptable thing to say. The leader of the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg, produced a similar condemnation. The political response across all three major British political parties was uniform. The conduct was unacceptable. The institutional acknowledgement of its unacceptability was being produced at the highest levels of British political life. The second dimension was the response from the British Pakistani community. Muhammad Yaqub Khan Abbasi, the father of Ahmed Raza Khan, spoke publicly. He told the Daily Mail, "When I saw the video, I was very, very hurt. That word he used is a hate word and should never be used against any Pakistani." Various Muslim community organizations in Britain produced similar statements. The response was substantial. The British Pakistani community, which had absorbed the conditions of British public discourse about its members across decades, was registering that the conduct of a senior royal had crossed a line that the community considered unacceptable. The third dimension was the response from the royal family itself. The institutional response by the framework's standard operations was the apology produced through Harry's office. The apology stated, "Prince Harry fully understands how offensive this term can be and is extremely sorry for any offense his words might cause." However, on this occasion 3 years ago, Prince Harry used the term without any malice and as a nickname about a highly popular member of his platoon. There is no question that Prince Harry was in any way seeking to insult his friend. The apology had several specific features that warrant examination. The first was the conditional structure, the if framing that the previous Nazi uniform apology had also used. The conditional acknowledgement of offense rather than the unconditional acknowledgement that the offense had been caused was, again, the framework's standard institutional construction. The second was the framing of the slur as a nickname, used without any malice. The framing was the institutional defense the framework had produced. The defense had specific implications. It implied that racial slurs could be acceptable when used as nicknames between friends. It implied that the absence of malice in the speaker's intent was sufficient to address the harm produced by the slur's use. It implied that the appropriate measure of the slur's impact was the speaker's intent rather than its effect on the people it referred to. These implications were, by any reasonable assessment of contemporary discourse about racial language, substantively wrong. The intent of the speaker is not the only relevant factor in assessing racial slurs. The effect of the slurs on the people they refer to, and on the broader culture in which they operate, is also relevant. The framing of slurs as nicknames used without malice had been, across the previous decades, the standard defensive framing that figures using racial slurs had deployed when their conduct became public. The framing had, in nearly every other context, been rejected by contemporary public discourse. Its deployment by the royal family in defense of Harry was the framework's institutional response, but the response was substantially miscalibrated to what contemporary British discourse about racial language was prepared to accept. The third feature of the apology was Khan's position in the framing. Khan was described as a highly popular member of his platoon. The framing positioned Khan as an institutional figure whose popularity within his peer group somehow modified the character of the slur Harry had used about him. The framing did not include any direct quotation from Khan himself about how he had experienced being filmed and described in the way the footage documented. The framing assumed Khan's position. The framing did not actually consult him. What did happen across the years following the footage's release was that Khan himself produced public statements about the incident. The statements were produced over the years that followed, in various interviews. Khan's general position by these statements was that he had not personally been offended by Harry's use of the term, and that he considered the term to have been used between friends. Khan's position is the position Khan was entitled to take. It is also a position that has been, in various subsequent assessments, complicated by the institutional dynamics involved. Khan was a junior officer in the British Army at the time of the footage's release. The senior royal whose conduct was at issue was a continuing institutional figure. The dynamics of institutional power between Khan and Harry were, in the standard operational reality of the British Army, asymmetrical. Khan's public statements about the incident occurred within those dynamics. What is undisputed is that the footage existed. The footage showed Harry using the slur. The slur was a slur. The institutional framework's defense of the user's nickname without malice was the framework's response, but the conduct itself, the use of the word Paki by a senior royal about a fellow officer cadet, had occurred. The conduct was on the documentary record. The documentary record could be examined. What the slur revealed about Harry, in retrospective examination, was specific. The slur was not a single isolated word produced under unusual conditions. The slur was being deployed casually, as a feature of Harry's ordinary vocabulary, in private filming. The casualness was the diagnostic feature. The slur was, in his ordinary mental operation, the word he reached for when describing a Pakistani-British colleague. The reach for the word was not, by his own implicit framing, a reach for a derogatory term. It was a reach for the word he had available for the purpose. The word was, in his vocabulary, the term that fit the slot. This had institutional implications. It revealed that Harry's vocabulary, in his early adult years, included racial slurs as available terms for describing his colleagues. The vocabulary had been formed somewhere, in his upbringing, in the various social circles he had been operating in the institutional culture of the British upper class that had produced him. The vocabulary's features were not, by any reasonable assessment, unique to him. They were features of the broader culture he had been formed in. The fact that the slurs were available in the vocabulary did not, however, absolve him of responsibility for their use. The use was his choice. The choice was made. The framework continued past the slur incident as it had continued past the Nazi uniform incident. The institutional management absorbed the immediate scandal. The political condemnations were registered. The apology was issued. The matter, by the framework's institutional logic, was closed within approximately 2 weeks of the original publication. Harry continued his military career. The framework continued its operations. His military career, across the years that followed, produced what is, by every available assessment, the most genuinely admirable dimension of his adult life. He served 2 operational tours in Afghanistan. The first tour, in 2007 to 2008, lasted approximately 10 weeks and ended early when his deployment was leaked to international media and his presence in the country had to be terminated for security reasons. The second tour, in 2012 to 2013, lasted 4.5 months. He served as an Apache helicopter pilot during the second tour. The service was, by every available account, real. The combat was real. The risks were real. The Apache helicopter operations involved direct engagement with Taliban forces in conditions of substantial danger. He emerged from the second tour with a credible military reputation. The reputation was earned. The flying he had done was the flying he had done. The combat operations he had participated in were operations he had participated in. The British military culture of the period had absorbed him as a serving officer rather than as a senior royal performing a public relations exercise. The institutional integrity of his service was substantial. What the service also produced, however, was the dimension that the 2023 publication of Spare would eventually make publicly visible. Harry, in the memoir, described his Afghanistan service in a particular way that produced significant subsequent controversy. He stated that he had killed 25 Taliban combatants during his Apache operations. He framed the killings through a specific metaphor. He had not, by his framing, viewed the people he had killed as people. He had viewed them as chess pieces that had been removed from the board. The framing reads, in the memoir's specific phrasing, "It's not a number that gave me any satisfaction, but neither was it a number that made me feel ashamed." The publication of this passage in Spare in January 2023 produced one of the most substantial military backlashes that any senior royal had received in modern British history. The backlash had several specific dimensions. The first was operational. Senior British military figures, including retired colonels Tim Collins and Richard Kemp, who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan respectively, condemned the public disclosure of the kill count. They argued that the disclosure produced specific operational risks. The Taliban, who continued to operate in Afghanistan as the governing force after the British and American withdrawal in 2021, would absorb the disclosure as propaganda material. The disclosure would be used in Taliban recruitment. The disclosure would create specific security risks for British veterans who continued to be vulnerable to Taliban-affiliated retaliation. The disclosure had been, in their assessment, professionally irresponsible. The second was philosophical. The chess pieces framing was the specific dimension that produced the most direct criticism. The framing implied that Harry had been dehumanizing the people he had killed during his combat operations. The dehumanization, the critics argued, was both inaccurate as a description of how British soldiers were trained and unacceptable as a description of how combat operations were supposed to be conducted. Colonel Richard Kemp specifically rejected the framing. He stated, "The idea that soldiers are trained to see the enemy as chess pieces to be swiped off the board is wrong. It's not how we trained people." The third was the Taliban response itself. The Taliban produced statements about the disclosure. Taliban spokespeople described Harry as a war criminal. Taliban propagandist Anas Haqqani produced a specific response. "The ones you killed were not chess pieces, they were humans. They had families who were waiting for their return." The Taliban response, in its rhetorical dimensions, occupied the morally awkward position the Taliban had occupied throughout the post-2021 period. The regime that had brutally suppressed Afghan civil society, particularly the rights of Afghan women and girls, was producing moralizing statements about a British prince's framing of his combat operations. The hypocrisy of the Taliban's position did not, however, fully invalidate the substantive point. Harry had described the people he had killed as chess pieces. The people he had killed had been people. The discrepancy between his framing and the reality of what combat operations actually involve was the substantive point that the various critics of the disclosure had been making. What the Spare disclosure revealed in retrospective examination was specific. The framing Harry had used to describe his combat operations was not the framing that British military culture in its institutional self-understanding had been organized around. It was a framing he had developed personally in his own internal accounting of what he had done in Afghanistan. The framing was, in some way that the publication had now made visible, the way Harry actually thought about the people he had killed. This connects to the broader pattern this documentary has been examining. The slur about Khan in 2006, the Nazi uniform in 2005, the Vegas conduct in 2012, the chess pieces framing in Spare in 2023. The pattern across these incidents is the pattern of a man whose moral imagination about other people had specific features that the institutional culture he had been formed in had not corrected. The features were not in their broader cultural origins unique to him. They were features of the culture that had produced him. The features were, however, present in him. They had been visible in his conduct since at least 2005. They had been documented across the subsequent 2 decades. The documentation had now reached the cumulative weight that the title of this documentary refers to. In the part that follows, we move to the years between the slur footage's emergence in 2009 and the institutional rupture that would eventually be triggered by his marriage to Meghan Markle in 2018. The years included the August 2012 Las Vegas incident, the various relationships with Chelsea Davy and Cressida Bonas, the various other features of his late 20s and early 30s that produced the public reputation the British press had crystallized by the time of the Vegas photographs. The pattern was developing. The framework was managing the development. The country was watching in pieces what the cumulative effect of the pattern was producing in the figure the framework had organized to maintain. The period between 2009 and 2012 produced, in Harry's documented public life, the kind of accumulated minor incidents that the British press of the period catalogued with the kind of attention that senior royal younger sons typically attracted. He was photographed leaving nightclubs in the early hours. He was photographed at country parties drinking with friends. He was photographed at the various social events that the calendar of his class required him to attend. The accumulation produced, by 2011 or 2012, the British press's working assessment that he was the wild royal, the brother whose conduct contrasted with William's more institutionally disciplined presentation, the figure whose social life provided the kind of regular content that royal coverage required. The framing was the framing the British tabloids had crystallized. The framing was, in its operational reality, somewhat exaggerated. Harry was not, by every available account from those who knew him at close range during the period, in any sense an exceptional drinker or substance user by the standards of his class and generation. He was a young man in his 20s who participated in the social life that his peer group participated in. His social life was, in its actual character, fairly conventional for British upper-class young men of the period. The framing had, however, become the framing. The framing required content. The content was produced by the daily reality of his social life, photographed and reported across the years. His relationships with women across this period were the other principal feature of the press coverage. The most sustained relationship of his late 20s was with Chelsea Davy, a Zimbabwean-born woman of British descent whom he had met during his gap year and with whom he had been involved across substantial portions of the period between 2004 and 2010. The relationship had been the kind of long-term, complicated involvement that produces neither resolution nor termination across its duration. They had broken up multiple times. They had reconciled multiple times. They had attempted, across the years of the relationship, to construct the kind of partnership that would survive the institutional pressures of Harry's position. The relationship had not, in the end, survived those pressures. Chelsea Davy ended the relationship definitively in 2010, by various subsequent accounts, because she had concluded that the institutional life her continuation in the relationship would have required was not the life she wanted to live. The Davy decision was, in retrospective examination, one of the small early indicators of the dynamic that would eventually produce the more substantial rupture of 2020. The institutional pressures around senior royal partners had become, by the second decade of the 21st century, more substantial than the framework's traditional operations had been organized to accommodate. Women whose partnerships with senior royals would have been institutionally managed in earlier periods were, by the early 2010s, increasingly registering that the management was not adequate compensation for the costs the partnerships imposed. Harry's subsequent relationship was with Cressida Bonas, an actress and model from another aristocratic British family. The relationship developed across 2012 and 2013. It was the relationship he was technically in at the time of the Las Vegas incident, the central documented incident of this part of the documentary that we will examine shortly. The Bonas relationship would continue, in various forms, until 2014, when it ended by what was characterized as mutual decision. The pattern of the relationships across this period, substantial relationships that did not survive into marriage, the cumulative effect of institutional pressures that the framework's traditional operations had not been organized to mitigate, was producing in Harry's late 20s the kind of romantic instability that began to develop into one of the framing concerns of the British press's coverage of him. He was approaching 30. He had not married. The institutional question of whether he would in due course find an appropriate partner had begun to be one of the standing concerns of the coverage. The Las Vegas incident occurred in August 2012. The institutional context of the trip is worth establishing. Harry had recently completed his Apache helicopter training. He had been promoted to captain. He was scheduled to deploy to Afghanistan for his second operational tour later in the year. The 4.5-month tour that we examined in Part 4, he had, in the framework's logic about giving senior royals brief recreational windows before significant deployments, been given approximately a week to take a private holiday before the deployment preparation began. He had decided to spend the week in Las Vegas with a small group of friends. The trip was, in its operational dimensions, the kind of bachelor-style holiday that British upper-class young men of his age regularly conducted. The group consisted of Harry and approximately 6 or 7 friends, including some senior royal protection officers who were continuing their professional duties throughout the trip. They had checked into the Wynn Las Vegas Hotel, one of the higher-end establishments on the Vegas Strip, on the 17th of August. Across the days that followed, they had participated in the standard activities that Las Vegas tourism produced. They had attended pool parties. They had been photographed at the public events. They had conducted in the visible portions of the trip the kind of celebrity tourist activities that produced regular content in the American entertainment press. The pool party photographs in particular had attracted significant attention. Harry had been photographed at the MGM Grand's Wet Republic pool party on the 18th of August. He had been seen interacting with various other celebrities and ordinary tourists at the venue. He had been described by some witnesses as having been drinking and dancing with the kind of energy that confirmed the press's framing of him as a particular kind of figure. Jennifer Lopez had also been at the same pool party by various accounts, though the two had not crossed paths. The visible portions of the trip had been registered by the entertainment press with the kind of routine celebrity tourism coverage that Las Vegas trips by figures like Harry typically produced. What had not been visible until the morning of the 21st of August was what had happened in the early hours of the 19th in Harry's private suite at the Wynn. The reconstruction that has been preserved across the various subsequent accounts, including Harry's own description in Spare, establishes the basic sequence. Harry and his friends had been at the hotel bar in the early hours after returning from another evening's social activities. They had encountered at the bar a group of women whose presence at the bar had not been institutionally prearranged. The women had, by Harry's own account, included some women who worked at the hotel and some women who had been at the blackjack tables. Harry's group had invited the women up to his suite. Approximately 4 or 5 women had accepted the invitation. In the suite, the activities had progressed through the standard sequence that such gatherings produce. There had been drinking. There had been social interaction. At some point, by Harry's spare account, after he had noticed that some of the women had been hovering near the billiard table where he and his friends had been playing, he had suggested that the group play strip billiards. He has framed the suggestion in his memoir as having been produced when one of the women had asked if she could play. He had not wanted to be rude. He had decided to up the stakes by proposing the strip variant. The game proceeded. The various participants undressed across the course of the game in proportion to their billiard performance. Harry, who has acknowledged in Spare that billiards is not his strong game, undressed substantially. The game reached the point at which Harry was naked. One of the women was naked. The remaining participants were in various states of undress. At this point, the photographs were taken. The photographs were taken by some of the women who were in the suite, using personal mobile phones. The photographs captured Harry naked, with his hands cupping his genitals, with one of the women, also naked, visible behind him. A second photograph captured a different scene from the same evening, with Harry naked, and in the process of embracing one of the women from behind. What the photographs did not capture, and what has been preserved through the various subsequent accounts of the evening, was any indication of non-consensual conduct or of any of the participants having been distressed by what was occurring. By every account that has been preserved, including the women's own subsequent statements through the Sun newspaper after the photographs had been published, the activities had been consensual. Harry had been described by witnesses to portions of the evening as having been a perfect gentleman who had at one point hugged a naked blonde woman from behind to protect her modesty. The photographs had been taken without his knowledge or consent. The women who had taken them had then sold them to TMZ, the American celebrity news website, for a substantial fee that has not been precisely documented. The photographs were published by TMZ on the 21st of August, 2012. The publication was conducted in TMZ's standard format. The photographs themselves alongside captions that described what the photographs showed. The publication generated, within hours, the kind of viral international response that TMZ publications routinely produced. The photographs spread across the international entertainment media. Within 24 hours, they had been seen by an estimated audience in the hundreds of millions across the various platforms that had reproduced them. The British press response was different from the American response. The British press, in its initial reaction, had decided to refrain from publishing the photographs. The decision had been made in consultation with St James's Palace, which had requested that the British media not reproduce the images on the basis that the images had been obtained through what the palace characterized as a privacy violation. The British press, with the partial exception that we will examine, had complied with the request across the first 3 days following the original publication. The compliance was in itself an institutional moment of some significance. The British press had developed, across the previous decades, a complicated relationship with the royal family that had included substantial willingness to publish embarrassing material about senior royals when such material became available. The compliance with the palace's request in this case represented an unusual deference to the family's institutional preferences. The deference had several specific causes. The photographs themselves had been obtained through circumstances that suggested privacy violation. Harry was about to deploy to Afghanistan on operational service. The institutional context had produced in the British press's editorial calculations the conditions under which the standard royal coverage practices had been temporarily modified. The deference did not last. On the 24th of August, 3 days after the original publication, the Sun tabloid newspaper made the editorial decision to publish the photographs in its Friday edition. The decision was made by managing editor David Dinsmore. The Sun's framing of the decision was preserved in Dinsmore's subsequent statement to E! News. For us, this is about the freedom of the press. This is about the ludicrous situation where a picture can be seen by hundreds of millions of people around the world on the internet, but can't be seen in the nation's favorite paper. The framing was the institutional defense the newspaper had produced. The defense had specific features. It was not in its operational reality primarily about freedom of the press in any abstract sense. It was about the Sun's commercial interests in publishing material that would generate circulation and traffic. The framing as freedom of the press had been the institutional cover that the commercial decision had been wrapped in. The Sun published the photographs. Circulation increased. The commercial decision had been validated. The publication produced, within the British media environment, the kind of breaking of the dam moment that such decisions typically produce. The other British tabloids, having been previously restrained by the palace's request, now had editorial cover to publish the photographs themselves. The photographs ran across multiple British outlets across the days that followed. The institutional restraint that had operated for 3 days had been eliminated. The photographs had become, by the end of August 2012, part of the standard documentary record of British royal coverage. Harry's response to the incident, in its initial public dimension, was the conventional institutional response that the framework was organized to produce. He returned to Britain from Las Vegas on the morning of the 19th of August, the morning after the strip billiards game, well before the photographs had been published. He had been spotted in Los Angeles hours later, then had returned to London. The framework's standard management mechanisms had begun operating. He had been removed from the location of the incident. He was being prepared for the institutional consequences that the publication would produce. The institutional consequences were, by the framework's standard practice, primarily the production of an apology and the management of the immediate press response. Harry had not, at the time of the incident, been required to produce an immediate public apology. The palace's institutional judgment was that the most effective response was the request for British press restraint, rather than the kind of formal acknowledgement that the framework's previous responses to scandals had produced. The institutional framing was that the photographs represented privacy violations rather than misconduct by Harry that required public penance. The framing was, in its operational logic, defensible. The photographs had been taken without Harry's consent. The conduct they documented, while embarrassing, had been conducted in private and had not produced any concrete harm to anyone. What was more revealing about Harry's response was the framing he produced when he eventually addressed the incident publicly. The address came in early 2013 in an interview given before he left Afghanistan to return to Britain after his second operational tour. He framed the Las Vegas incident as a classic example of him being too much army and not enough prince. The framing was the framing he had decided to produce. The framing had specific features that warrant examination. The framing implied that the Las Vegas conduct had been a function of his military identity rather than his royal identity. He had been conducting himself as a soldier on leave rather than as a senior royal performing his institutional duties. The dimension of the conduct that had been objectionable was, by his framing, the failure to maintain his royal identity rather than the conduct itself. He acknowledged that he had let himself down, his family down, and other people down. The acknowledgement was specific. The framing of why was the institutional framing he had chosen. What the framing did not address, and what subsequent retrospective examination has been more willing to address, was the underlying question of what the Las Vegas conduct had revealed about Harry's actual approach to his social life and to the women he was operating in. The strip billiards game had not been an isolated incident produced under unusual conditions. It had been a representative example of the kind of social conduct Harry was engaging in across this period. The pattern of the Las Vegas trip, the pool parties, the late-night socializing, the inviting of strangers to his hotel suite, the drinking, the activities that had produced the photographs, was not a pattern unique to that particular week. It was the standard pattern of his social life during the period. The framework's institutional defense had been, again, the framing that absolved Harry of the substantive responsibility for the conduct. He had been too much army. He had been on leave. He had been letting off steam. The framing's effectiveness as institutional defense was substantial. The framing had been broadly accepted by the British press in the months that followed. The Las Vegas incident had been absorbed by the framework's standard management practices into the catalogue of minor incidents that the senior royal younger son had produced and that the framework had absorbed. What the framing did not produce, however, was modification of Harry's underlying conduct. The pattern continued across the years that followed. The various social activities that had produced the Las Vegas situation continued to produce comparable situations in different forms. The framework continued to absorb the situations as they emerged. The cumulative effect produced by the time Harry began his relationship with Meghan Markle in 2016, the kind of established public reputation that the British press's working assessment of him had been producing for over a decade, the reputation by 2016 had become substantially fixed. Harry was the wild royal. Harry was the partying brother. Harry was the figure whose conduct produced regular content for the British tabloids. The institutional framework had managed each individual incident through its standard practices. The cumulative effect, however, had been the production of the public reputation that no individual institutional intervention had been able to substantially modify. What was about to happen, in the period between 2016 and 2020, would be the most substantial transformation of Harry's institutional position since his mother's death. The transformation would be produced in significant measure by his relationship with Meghan Markle and by the institutional dynamics that the relationship would produce. The transformation would also be shaped by the cumulative pattern we have been examining across the previous parts. Harry brought to the marriage the figure he had been formed into. The figure he had been formed into included the pattern of documented conduct we have examined. The framework's management of the pattern had not produced the substantive change in Harry that the pattern's accumulated weight had eventually required. In the part that follows, we move to the period of the marriage, the 2016 introduction to Meghan Markle, the May 2018 wedding at Windsor, the pregnancy, Archie's birth, the press treatment of Meghan that produced one of the most substantial documented racial coverage controversies in modern British media history, the November 2019 ITV documentary in which Meghan said she was not okay, the January 2020 announcement of stepping back, the complicated period in which two figures, Meghan and the institution that had received her, produced an institutional rupture that has in its various dimensions defined the most recent phase of Harry's life. The rupture would also reveal, in dimensions that the previous incidents had not, the dimensions of his pattern that involved his relationship to other people in his immediate environment. The next part will examine those dimensions. He met her in July 2016. He was 31 years old. The introduction had been arranged by a mutual friend whose name has not been publicly confirmed but who was, by various subsequent accounts, a London-based contact who knew both of them through different professional channels. The arrangement was the kind of small social introduction that two adults of their respective positions could have produced at any point in their lives without it producing any particular institutional consequences. The consequences in this case would be substantial. Meghan Markle was 34 years old at the time of their first meeting. She was, by every reasonable assessment, a figure whose previous life had not been organized to produce the kind of institutional position that her marriage to Harry would eventually impose on her. She had been born in Los Angeles in August 1981. Her mother, Doria Ragland, was a black American social worker. Her father, Thomas Markle, was a white American lighting director who had worked in television. The parents had divorced when Meghan was approximately 6. She had been raised primarily by her mother. She had attended private school. She had attended Northwestern University. She had pursued a career in acting that had by 2016 produced its principal achievement in her sustained role as Rachel Zane in the legal television drama Suits. She had been previously married. She had married Trevor Engelson, a film producer, in 2011. The marriage had ended in divorce in 2013. The divorce had not been the kind of public event that subsequent retrospective examination has sometimes suggested. It had been the kind of routine ending of a marriage that had not survived the practical pressures of two professional careers operating in different geographic locations. The divorce was, in itself, the kind of fact about her that British institutional culture would, in earlier periods, have considered disqualifying for senior royal marriage. The framework's logic about divorced women had, however, modified itself across the previous decades. By 2016, a divorced woman could marry a senior royal without producing the kind of institutional crisis that Wallis Simpson had produced in 1936. The framework had absorbed the broader cultural changes of the late 20th century. Meghan's previous marriage was not in 2016 the kind of obstacle to her potential relationship with Harry that it would have been in earlier periods. What was potentially more significant in the institutional context she was about to enter was her racial identity. Meghan was, by any reasonable description of her ancestry, biracial. Her mother was black, her father was white. She had grown up identifying with both sides of her ancestry in the various ways that biracial Americans of her generation had been negotiating across her formative years. She had, in her professional career, sometimes been cast as racially ambiguous. She had, in her personal identification, been increasingly direct about her black heritage as her career had progressed and as the broader American cultural conversation about racial identity had developed across the 2010s. The British royal family had not, in its modern history, produced a senior royal partner whose racial identity included black heritage. This is the structural fact that has to be established directly. The institutional culture of the British royal family was, in 2016, an institutional culture that had been substantially organized around the assumption that its senior figures would be racially homogeneous. The assumption had not been formally articulated. The assumption was the framework's traditional operation. The assumption was about to be modified by Harry's relationship with Meghan, and the modification would produce institutional dynamics that the framework had not been organized to absorb. The relationship developed quickly. By the autumn of 2016, Harry and Meghan were in a sustained relationship that the British tabloid press had begun to identify. The press response from the earlier stages included specific features that have been documented across the subsequent years. The coverage of Meghan by various major British tabloid outlets included framings that have been retrospectively identified as substantively racist. The Daily Mail in November 2016 ran a headline describing Meghan as almost straight outta Compton, a reference to a 2015 film about the rap group NWA set in a predominantly black neighborhood of Los Angeles. The framing positioned Meghan, who had grown up in upper-middle-class circumstances rather than in Compton, as a figure whose racial identity was being characterized through stereotyped associations. The pattern continued. Various other British tabloid outlets produced coverage that engaged with Meghan's racial identity through framings that subsequent academic analysis has documented as substantively different from the coverage that white royal partners had received. Catherine Middleton, who had been William's partner before her marriage and who had been the subject of comparable tabloid coverage across her own pre-marriage period, had not been described through racially coded framings. The differential between the coverage of the two women was substantial. The differential was, in retrospective examination, one of the foundational features of the institutional dynamics that would eventually produce the rupture. Harry registered the differential coverage. He registered it within months of the relationship becoming public. In November 2016, he produced an unusual public statement through Kensington Palace that addressed the press coverage of Meghan directly. The statement was the first of its kind that Kensington Palace had produced about a senior royal's romantic partner during the partner's pre-marriage period. The statement addressed what Harry characterized as the racial undertones of the coverage. The statement specifically condemned the conduct of the press toward Meghan. The statement was, in its institutional dimensions, the first public manifestation of what would eventually become Harry's broader institutional posture toward the British press. He had registered, by November 2016, that the press was treating Meghan in ways that he considered unacceptable. He had identified the racial dimensions of the treatment. He had, by issuing the public statement, broken with the framework's traditional institutional logic about how senior royals managed press relations. The framework's traditional logic had been the careful management of the relationship between the royal family and the tabloid press. Harry's statement had been the institutional declaration that, at least in the case of Meghan, the careful management would not be the response he was producing. The statement was the first of various subsequent confrontations between Harry and the British press that would, across the following years, develop into the active hostility that has defined his subsequent institutional posture. The hostility had its foundations, as we examined in Part 2, in his mother's death and in his cumulative experience of the British tabloid press across his entire visible life. The relationship with Meghan had now produced in his institutional reality the new specific dimension of the hostility, the conviction that the press was, in its treatment of his future wife, replicating the kind of institutional pursuit that had contributed to his mother's death. The relationship progressed across 2017. The engagement was announced in November 2017. The wedding was held on the 19th of May 2018 at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. The wedding was, by various measures, one of the most globally significant royal events of the previous decade. The estimated television audience exceeded 1 billion. The cultural moment of the wedding, a senior member of the British royal family marrying a biracial American actress, was in its institutional dimensions the kind of departure from traditional royal practice that the framework had been gradually accommodating across the previous generations and that had now been concretely manifested in the Windsor ceremony. What followed the wedding, across the months of 2018 and 2019, was the institutional reality of Meghan's life as a working senior royal. The reality had specific features that have been documented across the subsequent years. The British tabloid coverage of her continued, and in many measures intensified. The coverage of her was, by every available comparison with the coverage of comparable white royal women, substantively different in ways that have been retrospectively examined. A specific case that has been preserved in the documentary record concerns the coverage of Catherine Middleton's pregnancy with Princess Charlotte in 2014 to 2015, compared with the coverage of Meghan's pregnancy with Archie in 2018 to 2019. Catherine had been photographed cradling her pregnant abdomen during her second pregnancy. The coverage had described the gesture as touching maternal instinct. Meghan had been photographed performing the same gesture during her own pregnancy. The coverage had described the gesture, in various tabloid framings, as being performed for show or as being indicative of vanity. The differential, the same physical gesture by two pregnant women being framed in opposite ways, was the kind of small daily reality that Meghan was operating inside. The differential had been catalogued by various media analysts who had, across 2018 and 2019, begun producing systematic comparisons of the coverage of Meghan and Catherine. The analyses had concluded that the coverage of Meghan was, on multiple measurable dimensions, substantively more hostile than the coverage of Catherine. The hostility had specific racial dimensions that had not been present in the coverage of the white royal women. Archie was born on the 6th of May 2019 in London. The birth produced the institutional decision about what title Archie would hold. The decision was made through the standard framework that had governed such decisions for previous royal births. Archie was a great-grandchild of the reigning monarch through a younger son. By the standard rules established under King George V's 1917 letters patent, he would not be entitled to the style of His Royal Highness or to the title of Prince. He would receive these designations only when his grandfather Charles ascended the throne, at which point, under the existing 1917 letters patent, he would automatically become a prince by virtue of being the grandchild of the reigning monarch through a senior royal son. This is the institutional context that subsequent disputes about Archie's title need to be understood within. Archie was not refused a title that he was entitled to. He was, by the existing framework, not entitled to a title at the time of his birth. The framework's traditional logic about which royal children received titles at birth was the logic that had been operating across multiple generations. The logic, however, had been the subject of various subsequent claims by Harry and Meghan that more substantive institutional considerations had been at play in the decisions about Archie's status. The most consequential of these claims emerged in March 2021, in the Oprah Winfrey interview that we will examine shortly. Meghan claimed in the interview that there had been concerns and conversations within the royal family about Archie's skin color during her pregnancy. The specific allegations were that someone within the family had raised questions in conversation with Harry about how dark Archie's skin would be when he was born. Meghan declined to identify the family member who had raised the concerns. Harry, in subsequent statements, also declined to identify the figure but confirmed that the conversations had occurred. The allegations, when they emerged, produced one of the most substantial institutional crises in the modern British royal family. The Queen's response, issued through Buckingham Palace shortly after the interview's broadcast, was characteristic of the framework's institutional management practices. The statement read, "The whole family is saddened to learn the full extent of how challenging the last few years have been for Harry and Meghan. The issues raised, particularly that of race, are concerning. While some recollections may vary, they are taken very seriously and will be addressed by the family privately." The phrase "some recollections may vary" became, in subsequent examination, one of the most analyzed institutional formulations in modern royal communication. The phrase was, in its operational dimensions, the framework's preservation of the institutional position that the allegations remained contested rather than confirmed. The phrase did not deny the allegations. The phrase did not confirm them. The phrase produced the institutional space within which the family could continue to operate without producing direct accountability for the conduct that had been alleged. What had also been operating, in the period leading up to the rupture, were institutional dynamics within the royal household that had produced their own documented controversies. In October 2018, by various contemporary accounts, complaints had been made by members of the Kensington Palace staff against Meghan herself, alleging that she had bullied them. The complaints had been filed through the palace's HR mechanisms. They had not been publicly disclosed at the time. The disclosure came in March 2021, in the days immediately preceding the Oprah interview, through the Times of London. The bullying allegations, when they were disclosed, produced a complicated institutional situation. The allegations were specific. They had been made through formal channels. They had been preserved in palace documentation. The allegations, however, had not been adjudicated through any concluded internal process at the time of their public disclosure. The palace announced in March 2021 that an internal investigation would be conducted. The investigation was conducted. The results were not, by any subsequent institutional decision, made public. The palace announced in 2022 that the investigation had been completed and that policies had been updated, but did not release the substantive findings. The bullying allegations have produced, in subsequent retrospective examination, the kind of complicated institutional question that the framework's standard practices were not equipped to resolve cleanly. Some former staff members who had served Meghan during her time as a working royal produced accounts that supported the bullying allegations. Other former staff members produced accounts that disputed them or that provided context that complicated them. The accounts have not produced consensus. Meghan herself has denied the bullying allegations consistently and has framed them as part of a broader pattern of institutional briefing against her by figures within the royal household. What this dimension of the situation has revealed in retrospective examination is the complicated character of the rupture itself. The rupture was not simply the product of institutional racism within the royal family. The rupture was not simply the product of difficult conduct by Meghan within the household. Both dimensions were probably real. The institution had likely produced the kind of treatment of Meghan that her allegations of racism had identified. Meghan had likely produced the kind of treatment of staff that the bullying allegations had identified. The rupture, in its actual operational character, had been produced by the interaction between these dimensions across the relatively brief period of Meghan's time as a working royal. The November 2019 ITV documentary, in which Meghan addressed the cumulative pressures of her royal life directly, was the public moment at which the cumulative effect of these dynamics became substantially visible to the British public. The documentary, titled Harry and Meghan: An African Journey, had been produced during the couple's tour of southern Africa. The interviewer Tom Bradby, who had worked with Harry across various previous projects, asked Meghan how she was. Her response, that she was not really okay, was the public acknowledgement that her time as a working royal was producing the kind of cumulative damage that she was no longer prepared to absorb without acknowledgement. The decision to step back from senior royal duties was announced in January 2020. The announcement was made by Harry and Meghan through Instagram, with the announcement preceding any communication of the decision through the formal institutional channels of the royal family. The institutional response from the Queen was characteristic, the production of a brief statement acknowledging the decision and indicating that the family would work through the implications. The negotiations that followed across January 2020, the Sandringham Summit, the various institutional discussions about what the new arrangement would actually look like, produced the framework that has, with various modifications, defined Harry and Meghan's position since. They moved to Canada initially, then to California by March 2020. They had, by spring 2020, been living in Tyler Perry's house in Los Angeles before purchasing their own residence in Montecito later that year. The Montecito house, which they purchased for approximately $14.65 million, has been their primary residence since. They have produced 2 children, Archie, born May 2019, and Lilibet, born June 2021. They have produced various professional projects, including the Netflix documentary series, the Spotify podcast that was eventually cancelled, and the various other media engagements that have constituted their post-royal professional life. The March 2021 Oprah interview was the principal public moment at which the rupture's accumulated dimensions were articulated by Harry and Meghan to a global audience. The interview was watched by an estimated audience of 17 million in the United States and substantially more across the various international markets where it was subsequently broadcast. The substantive content of the interview included Meghan's discussion of her experiences as a working royal, the racism allegations we have examined, her account of having experienced suicidal ideation during her time in the family, and the various other dimensions of what she had absorbed. The interview produced, in the British press response, the kind of polarized reception that has defined the British coverage of Harry and Meghan since 2020. The right-leaning press produced sustained criticism of the interview, characterizing it as exaggerated or as institutionally damaging in ways that warranted public condemnation. The left-leaning press produced more sympathetic coverage, treating the allegations as substantive and as deserving of institutional accountability. The British public itself, by various polling conducted in the days following the interview, was substantially divided along generational and political lines. What this part of the documentary has been examining is the period in which Harry's institutional position transformed substantially. He arrived at the period as a senior working royal with a documented pattern of difficult conduct. He left the period as a former working royal living in California with his American wife, in active institutional rupture with his family of origin, with his future participation in the institution he had been born into substantially uncertain. The transformation was real. The transformation was produced by the interaction between Harry's existing pattern of conduct, Meghan's institutional position as a biracial American entering the British royal family, and the institutional culture of the family itself with its documented limitations regarding race and its complicated treatment of senior royal partners. In the part that follows, we move to the specific dimensions of the rupture that emerged in 2023 with the publication of Spare, the memoir's various revelations, the alleged 2019 altercation with William at Nottingham Cottage, the cocaine admissions, the other dimensions of the memoir that produced the institutional crisis the title of this documentary refers to. The complete public silence from Kensington Palace about the most serious of the allegations, the silence that the title characterizes as burying every word, the cumulative effect of the memoir on the institutional position Harry now occupies. The next part will examine these dimensions and what they revealed about the figure Harry has become in the years since the rupture. The incident occurred at Nottingham Cottage in 2019. The exact date has not been precisely established in the public record. Harry, in his account in Spare, places the incident in the period when his institutional difficulties with the broader royal family had become substantial but had not yet produced the public rupture that would emerge in January 2020. The cottage had been Harry and Meghan's residence on the grounds of Kensington Palace from the time of their marriage in May 2018 until they had moved to Frogmore Cottage at Windsor in April 2019. The Nottingham Cottage location places the incident in approximately the first 10 months of the marriage, during the period when the various institutional pressures on Meghan's position had been accumulating but had not yet produced the public manifestations that would eventually develop. What occurred between Harry and William, by Harry's account, can be reconstructed from the Spare description. William had arrived at the cottage. The visit had not been social. William had come to address what Harry has characterized as the whole rolling catastrophe of their relationship. The two brothers had been operating, across the months preceding the visit, in a state of increasing institutional tension that the framework's standard mechanisms had not been able to resolve. The tension had been substantially produced by what Harry characterized as William's attitude toward Meghan. William had, by Harry's account, formed the institutional assessment that Meghan was difficult, rude, and abrasive. Harry had formed the institutional assessment that William's characterization was the institutional repetition of the press narrative about Meghan that had been operating in the British tabloids since 2016. The conversation that occurred at Nottingham Cottage was, by Harry's reconstruction, not a productive one. The two brothers had begun in the kitchen of the small cottage. They had exchanged the kind of mutually frustrated statements that adult brothers in active conflict produce when their accumulated grievances reach the surface. Harry had offered William water. William had taken it. The conversation had escalated. At a specific point that Harry's Spare account locates with some precision, William had set down the water, called Harry another name. Harry does not specify what name in the memoir, and came at me. The physical incident that followed has been preserved in the Spare text, with the kind of specific reconstruction that has produced both extensive subsequent quotation and substantial subsequent dispute. Harry's description in the memoir reads, "He grabbed me by the collar, ripping my necklace, and he knocked me to the floor. I landed on the dog's bowl, which cracked under my back, the pieces cutting into me." The description has specific features that warrant examination. The physical sequence is detailed: the collar grab, the ripped necklace, the fall to the floor, the dog's bowl breaking under the impact, the pieces of the bowl cutting Harry's back. The specificity of the reconstruction has been, in subsequent assessments, both a feature of the description's credibility and a subject of skeptical examination. Detailed reconstructions of physical incidents that occurred years before their disclosure can be either genuine recollections that have been preserved by the significance of the events, or constructed accounts that have been organized to produce specific institutional effects in their disclosure. The available evidence does not allow definitive resolution of which character Harry's description has. What the description does establish, regardless of its precise factual character, is the nature of what Harry was alleging in his memoir. He was alleging that the heir to the British throne, his older brother, the Prince of Wales, had physically assaulted him in the kitchen of his own home. The allegation was, in its institutional dimensions, one of the most serious internal allegations that any senior royal had produced against another senior royal in the modern history of the British monarchy. The allegation, if accurate, would have constituted a criminal offence under English law. The allegation was being produced in a memoir intended for global commercial publication. What did not occur in the period following the incident was any of the institutional responses that would conventionally have followed such an event. Harry did not, by every available account, report the incident to police. He did not pursue civil action against William. He did not, until the publication of Spare in 2023, disclose the incident publicly. The institutional response within the royal family itself, to the extent that it occurred at all, was conducted entirely through internal channels that have not been publicly documented. This is the dimension of the case that the title of this documentary refers to. The burial the title characterizes was, in its most literal sense, the silence that the institutional response had produced. Kensington Palace, which had institutional responsibility for William's public communications, did not produce any public acknowledgement of the incident at any point between its occurrence in 2019 and the publication of Spare in 2023. The silence was the institutional response. The framework's traditional logic about internal family conflicts had absorbed the incident through the standard mechanism of producing no public acknowledgement. The silence continued after the publication of Spare. Kensington Palace, in the period following the memoir's release in January 2023, declined to comment on the allegations. The palace did not deny them. The palace did not confirm them. The palace produced no statement about the specific allegations Harry had made. The institutional response was the production of complete silence about the allegations themselves, while continuing the working operations of the Prince of Wales's office without acknowledgement that the allegations existed. This silence is the framework's traditional response to internal family scandals. The framework had produced comparable silences in response to comparable scandals across previous decades. The Queen Mother's institutional silences about the various dimensions of family conduct that we examined in earlier documentaries had been the framework's standard mechanism. The silence's effectiveness, as institutional management, had depended on the absence of competing public accounts that would force the silence to be addressed. In Harry's case, the silence had been competing with Harry's own active public account through Spare and the various subsequent media engagements. The publication of Spare on the 10th of January 2023 was the institutional event that crystallized the cumulative effect of Harry's post-2020 disclosures. The memoir had been written in collaboration with the American ghostwriter J.R. Mehringer, who had previously written for Andre Agassi's memoir Open and for various other significant non-fiction projects. The collaboration produced, across the 18 months of the memoir's writing, the substantial work of approximately 410 pages that had then been published simultaneously in multiple languages around the world. The memoir had been the subject of intensive pre-publication management. Penguin Random House, the publisher, had implemented unusually strict security measures around the manuscript. Advance copies had been tightly controlled. The publication date had been organized to produce the maximum commercial effect across the international markets where the book would be sold. The institutional management of the publication had been substantial. What had not been managed, however, was the leak that occurred 5 days before the official publication date. A Spanish-language version of the memoir had been mistakenly placed on sale in Spain on the 5th of January. The early sale had been brief. The books had been removed from sale within hours. But during the brief period of availability, copies had been purchased by various journalists and others who had then begun producing the early reporting on the memoir's contents. The early reporting produced, across the days between the 5th and 10th of January, the international media coverage that we will examine. The Guardian had been the first major outlet to obtain a leaked copy. The Guardian's coverage on the 5th of January produced the first public disclosure of the William altercation. Other outlets followed across the subsequent days. By the time of the official publication on the 10th of January, the principal contents of the memoir had been substantially reported across the international media. The memoir was being read in the context of the previous 5 days' reporting rather than as a fresh disclosure on its publication day. The contents of the memoir, beyond the William altercation, included the various other dimensions that this documentary has examined in earlier parts. The cocaine admissions from Harry's adolescence, the detailed account of his Afghanistan service, including the chess pieces framing of the 25 Taliban combatants he had killed, the detailed account of his relationships with Chelsea Davy and Cressida Bonas, the various accounts of his relationships with senior royal family members, including substantial discussion of his relationship with his father and his stepmother Camilla, the various dimensions of his account of Meghan's experience as a working royal, including direct rebuttals of specific institutional positions that had been previously maintained. The memoir also included a number of disclosures that produced their own specific subsequent controversies. Harry described losing his virginity in what he characterized as a humiliating episode with an older lady in a field behind a busy pub. He described an incident in which he had suffered frostbite on his penis during a polar expedition. He described the various small details of his domestic life with Meghan, including specific details that some subsequent assessments characterized as institutionally damaging in their disclosure. The cumulative effect of the memoir, as the British public absorbed it across the days following publication, was substantially negative for Harry's public reputation. The British press response was almost universally hostile. Even outlets that had previously been more sympathetic to Harry and Meghan, The Guardian in particular, produced editorial assessments that characterized the memoir as having damaged Harry's institutional position rather than restored it. The writer Anne Wilson in the Daily Mail characterized the memoir as calculated and despicable, and as having succeeded in making the British public sympathize with the royal family, not with him. The polling response in the British public confirmed the editorial assessments. By various polls conducted in the weeks following the memoir's publication, Harry's approval rating in the British public had declined substantially. The decline was the kind that the framework's standard institutional management had not been able to mitigate. The memoir had produced in its cumulative effect the kind of substantial damage to Harry's public reputation that the previous individual incidents we have examined had not individually produced. What the memoir had also produced, however, was the documentary record itself. The various incidents we have examined across this documentary had been before spare, scattered across multiple individual public moments without the kind of comprehensive narrative that would have allowed the cumulative pattern to be examined. The Nazi uniform had been one event, the Sandhurst slur had been another, the Vegas photographs had been another. Each event had been managed by the framework's institutional practices as an individual incident requiring individual management. The cumulative pattern had not been visible in any single institutional context. Spare changed this. The memoir had assembled the various incidents into a single narrative produced by the figure most directly involved. The narrative had its own institutional limitations. Harry's framings of various incidents were, by his own positioned interest, the framings most favorable to him, but the assembly itself had been substantial. The British public, after January 2023, had access to the cumulative pattern in a way that previous individual incidents had not made available. The cumulative pattern was the pattern this documentary has been examining. The memoir's commercial success was also substantial. The book sold over 1.4 million copies in its first week of publication in the United States alone, making it one of the most successful non-fiction memoir launches in publishing history. The international sales, across the various markets where the book was published, produced cumulative figures that exceeded any previous royal memoir by substantial margins. The memoir was, in commercial terms, an enormous success. The success had specific institutional implications. Harry had, through the memoir, produced the kind of independent commercial success that did not depend on his institutional position within the royal family. The economic foundation for his post-royal life had been substantially established by the memoir's commercial performance. What this had done in retrospective examination was provide Harry with the financial independence that allowed him to maintain the institutional rupture with his family of origin. The framework's traditional mechanism for managing senior royals who departed from institutional discipline had included the financial dependency that the framework's economic structures imposed. Senior royals who departed had typically been managed through their continuing economic dependence on the institutional resources the family controlled. Harry's commercial success through Spare had broken that mechanism. He was not, after Spare, economically dependent on the institutional resources he had previously relied on. He had produced his own commercial foundation. The foundation allowed him to maintain the rupture without producing the kind of economic pressures that the framework's traditional management would have eventually applied. The institutional response from the royal family, beyond the public silence we have examined, was conducted through the small mechanisms available to the framework. Harry was not invited to certain royal events. Harry was, when included in events, positioned in ways that minimized his institutional visibility. Harry's two children, Archie and Lilibet, were not formally included in the working operations of the royal family. The framework's traditional management of figures who had departed from institutional discipline was being applied to Harry through the small daily mechanisms that the framework's operational reality made available. The response was characteristic. The framework had managed the Duke of Windsor, Edward VIII, through comparable mechanisms across the decades following his abdication. The framework had managed Princess Margaret through comparable mechanisms during the periods of her conduct that the family had considered institutionally inadequate. The framework had developed across centuries the small mechanisms by which figures who had departed from institutional discipline could be managed without producing the kind of formal exclusion that would itself produce additional institutional crises. The mechanisms were being applied to Harry. The mechanisms were operating with the considered consistency the framework's standard practices required. What the mechanisms had not been able to produce was the modification of Harry's own institutional posture. He had continued, across the period since Spare, to produce the various media projects that had become his post-royal professional life. He had continued the legal proceedings against the British tabloids. He had continued the various public engagements that the Invictus Games and the other charitable organizations he was associated with required of him. He had continued in his post-royal institutional position, the active public life that the framework's traditional mechanisms had not been able to constrain. The institutional standoff that emerged after Spare has continued, with various modifications, into the period of this documentary's preparation. The death of Queen Elizabeth II in September 2022 had produced one institutional moment that had briefly altered the dynamics. Harry and Meghan had attended the funeral. The family had performed the institutional unity that the moment required. The temporary modification of the rupture had occurred. The institutional return to the standoff occurred quickly. The post-funeral relationships had not been substantially modified by the brief period of institutional cooperation. The diagnosis of King Charles's cancer in early 2024 had produced another institutional moment. Harry had travelled to London immediately after the diagnosis was announced. The visit had been brief, approximately 24 hours. The substance of his time with his father has not been publicly documented. The institutional positions of the principals involved had not been substantially modified by the visit. The institutional standoff continued. What had also continued across the period since Spare was Harry's various legal proceedings against the British tabloid press. The proceedings had been substantial. The phone-hacking lawsuits against Mirror Group newspapers, News Group newspapers, and associated newspapers had been pursued across multiple years and had produced in some cases substantial financial settlements. The proceedings had also produced significant disclosures about the conduct of the British tabloid press across the period of Harry's life. The disclosures had been, in their cumulative effect, validating of the institutional posture toward the press that Harry had been developing since at least 2016. The legal proceedings had also confirmed, in a different dimension, the institutional position Harry was now occupying. He was, as of the date of this documentary's preparation, the figure who had pursued the most aggressive legal action against the British tabloid press of any senior royal in modern history. The framework's traditional logic about how senior royals manage their relationships with the press had been substantially modified by Harry's individual choices. The framework had been organized around the careful management of the relationship. Harry had organized his own conduct around active legal confrontation with the institutions the framework had previously managed. In the final part of this documentary, we move to the contemporary situation, the current institutional position, the continuing legal proceedings, the relationship with King Charles, which has been substantially affected by his cancer diagnosis, the relationship with William, which by every available account remains broken, the two children, Archie and Lilibet, who are being raised in California outside the institutional structures of the British royal family, the closing meditation on what Harry has become across the long arc of his life, and what the documentary record now holds about the figure he has been across his 5 decades of visible public existence. Because the figure who emerges from the cumulative examination of his life is not the figure either his defenders or his critics have produced in their respective framings. The figure is more complicated. The figure includes the trauma of his mother's death and the institutional inadequacy that had failed to address it. The figure includes the documented incidents of his adult conduct that the institutional management had absorbed across his life. The figure includes the substantive marriage to Meghan and the substantial reasons for the institutional rupture the marriage had eventually produced. The figure includes the spare memoir and the various other public productions that have been the principal features of his post-royal life. The figure includes the legal proceedings that have, in their cumulative effect, modified the institutional culture of the British tabloid press. The complications are real. Both pictures of him are real. The historical record now holds the pattern. Just a thing come into my mind. Tell us in the comments where you are from. Also, if you like this documentary, please consider subscribing. He is 41 years old. He lives at the Montecito residence in Santa Barbara County, California, with his wife Meghan and their 2 children Archie and Lilibet. Archie is 6, Lilibet is 4. The household around them includes the small staff that the practical reality of their post-royal professional life requires, the security personnel, the household staff, the various professional figures whose roles support the media projects and legal proceedings that constitute the family's working operations. The household is substantial. The household is also, by every available account, substantially private in the dimensions that the family has been able to maintain privacy about. The children are not photographed regularly. The family's daily life is conducted away from the press attention that their parents' senior royal positions had, at various points, imposed on them. This is the practical reality of Harry's life as of 2026. He has been resident in California for nearly 6 years. He has not, in any sustained sense, lived in Britain since January 2020. The British residences that had been his across his life, Kensington Palace, Frogmore Cottage, the various other royal accommodations that his institutional position had provided, are no longer his. The Frogmore Cottage at Windsor that Harry and Meghan had renovated as their post-Nottingham Cottage residence had been institutionally returned in 2023, when King Charles had asked them to vacate the property as part of the broader institutional adjustment of their position. The institutional connection to British royal residential infrastructure has been substantially terminated. What remains of his connection to the institution he was born into is a complicated set of legal and titular positions that have not been formally resolved. He retains the title of Duke of Sussex. The title was conferred on him by the Queen on his marriage in 2018. The title has not been removed. The institutional discussions about whether senior royal titles can or should be removed from figures who have departed from the working royal family have continued across the post-2020 period without producing definitive institutional decisions. Harry remains, by the framework's continuing operations, a Duke of Sussex, who is also a private citizen of dual British and American residence, whose institutional engagement with the British monarchy has been substantially attenuated. He retains his position in the line of succession. He is, as of the date of this documentary's preparation, 5th in line to the British throne, behind William, Prince George, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis. His position in the succession would, by the framework's traditional logic, only become institutionally consequential in the kind of catastrophic sequence of events that successive royal deaths would produce. The position is theoretically maintained. The probability of its becoming actually consequential is negligible. The framework has not, by any institutional decision, removed him from the succession, but the practical implications of his position are minimal. His relationship with his father has been the most substantial single feature of his post-2020 institutional position that has shown signs of complicated development. Charles had ascended the throne in September 2022 following the death of Queen Elizabeth II. The accession had produced in the immediate period the kind of institutional moment in which Harry's continuing connection to the family had been required to operate publicly. Harry had attended his grandmother's funeral. He had walked in the procession. He had performed the institutional duties his continuing position required. The performance had been adequate. The performance had not, however, been the kind of substantial reconciliation that the institutional moment might, in different family conditions, have produced. The cancer diagnosis of King Charles in February 2024 had produced the most substantial subsequent moment of attempted reconciliation. Charles had publicly announced the diagnosis through Buckingham Palace. The diagnosis had been characterized as a form of cancer that had been identified during a procedure related to a benign prostate condition that Charles had been receiving treatment for. The specific form of cancer had not been publicly disclosed. The treatment was being conducted privately. The palace had produced the kind of brief institutional acknowledgement that such diagnoses required while maintaining the privacy of the medical specifics. Harry's response to the diagnosis had been immediate. He had travelled from California to London within days of the public announcement. The visit was brief. He had spent approximately 30 minutes with his father at Clarence House before continuing his travel back to California. The visit had not, by every available account, produced any substantive modification of the broader institutional position the two principals occupied with respect to each other. Charles had received him. The reception had been warm. The reception had not, however, been the kind of institutional reset that the family rupture would have required to produce substantive change. The relationship between Harry and Charles has, across the period since the cancer diagnosis, continued in the modified form that the diagnosis has imposed. The two principals have been in more direct communication than they had been across the previous years of the rupture. The communication has been conducted, by various accounts, primarily through the institutional channels that Harry's continuing position made available. The senior figures of the royal household who handled the small institutional matters that connected the principals across the geographic distance. The substantive father-son engagement that the cancer diagnosis might, in different family conditions, have produced, has not been the engagement that has actually emerged. The relationship has improved. The relationship has not, in any substantive sense, been restored to the kind of warm filial connection that diagnosis-induced reconciliations sometimes produce. The relationship with William has not improved. This is the structural fact that the available evidence has consistently produced across the post-2020 period. The two brothers, by every available account from those who have observed them at close range across the years since Spare, have been operating in the kind of substantial estrangement that has not been modified by any of the institutional moments that have emerged across the period. They had not spoken meaningfully at Queen Elizabeth's funeral in September 2022. They had not spoken meaningfully at the various subsequent institutional moments that had brought them into the same physical proximity. The estrangement has been, by the available indications, sustained by both principals across the years since the Spare allegations. The estrangement has specific institutional dimensions that warrant examination. William, in his position as the future king, has institutional responsibilities that include the projection of family unity in moments of national institutional significance. The dimensions have produced, across the post-2020 period, the institutional pressures on William that his estrangement from Harry has complicated. The complications have been managed, by the framework's standard mechanisms, through the various institutional arrangements that minimize the visible consequences of the estrangement. The principals have not been required to be in close physical proximity at family events. The principals have not been required to produce public statements that would have addressed the estrangement directly. The framework has absorbed the estrangement into its operational reality without requiring its public acknowledgement. What Harry's two children have been receiving, across this period, has been a childhood substantially different from the childhood Harry himself had received in the equivalent age range. Archie and Lilibet are being raised in California. They are being raised in a household in which both parents are present in the daily reality of their lives. They are being raised away from the British tabloid press that had defined the institutional pressures of Harry's own childhood. They are being raised, by every available account from those who have observed the family in California, in conditions of substantial domestic stability that contrast sharply with the conditions that had operated around Harry's own early years. The institutional question of whether Archie and Lilibet would, at some future point, occupy any working role in the British royal family has not been answered. The children retain their princely titles. They had been formally elevated to Prince and Princess upon Charles's accession in 2022 by the existing 1917 letters patent that automatically conferred the titles on the grandchildren of the reigning monarch through senior royal sons. The titles are theoretical rather than practical in their current operation. The children are not engaged with the institutional life of the family in any working sense. They are being raised by their parents' decisions as Americans whose royal connections are facts of their lineage rather than features of their daily lives. The legal proceedings against the British tabloid press have continued across the period since Spare. The proceedings have been substantial. Harry won his case against Mirror Group newspapers in December 2023, with the High Court finding that the publishers of the Daily Mirror and Sunday Mirror had used unlawful methods including phone hacking to obtain information about him over a sustained period. The court ordered Mirror Group newspapers to pay Harry £140,600 in damages. The settlement was in itself modest by the standards of high-profile civil litigation. Its institutional significance, however, was substantial. The judgment had established through the judicial process that the British tabloid press had engaged in the unlawful conduct toward Harry that he had been alleging for years. The institutional vindication was the substantive outcome. Subsequent settlements with News Group newspapers, the publishers of The Sun, were reached in early 2025. The settlement amount was not publicly disclosed but was characterized in subsequent reporting as substantial. The settlement included an unconditional apology from News Group newspapers for the unlawful activities that had been conducted against Harry across the previous decades. The apology was, in its institutional dimensions, the most substantial acknowledgement by the British tabloid press of its conduct toward a senior royal that the modern history of British media had produced. The apology had been earned by Harry's sustained legal pursuit across the previous years. The legal proceedings have produced, in their cumulative effect, the kind of institutional change in the British tabloid press that no previous senior royal had been able to produce. The framework's traditional logic about senior royal management of the press had been the careful institutional accommodation that we examined in earlier parts. Harry had rejected the accommodation. The rejection had produced, through sustained legal action, the kind of substantive institutional consequences that the framework's traditional management had specifically not produced. The institutional culture of the British tabloid press has been, by the cumulative effect of Harry's legal proceedings, modified in ways that will continue to operate across the years that follow. This is the institutional contribution Harry has made through his post-royal life. The contribution is real. The contribution exists alongside the documented pattern of his personal conduct that we have examined across this documentary. Both dimensions are part of the historical record now. The documentary record holds the Nazi uniform of January 2005. The documentary record holds the slur of January 2009. The documentary record holds the Las Vegas conduct of August 2012. The documentary record holds the Spare admissions of January 2023. The cocaine, the chess pieces, the various dimensions of the memoir that the British public absorbed across the days following publication. The documentary record also holds the legal proceedings that have produced the institutional accountability of the British tabloid press for conduct that had been operating against Harry and his mother across decades. Both dimensions are him. Both are real. What the documentary record does not provide is the kind of clean moral resolution that would allow the figure Harry has been to be reduced to either victim narrative or villain narrative. He is more complicated than either reduction would accommodate. He was the traumatized child of Diana whose grief was institutionally inadequately addressed. He was the young man who chose the Nazi uniform, who used the racial slur, who participated in the Las Vegas conduct, who described his Afghanistan combat operations as removing chess pieces from a board. He was the husband whose marriage to Meghan produced the institutional rupture with the family of his birth. He is the father whose 2 children are being raised in California outside the institution he was raised inside. He is the figure whose legal proceedings have produced the institutional accountability of the British tabloid press for conduct that had been operating against him and his mother across decades. All of these are him. All are real. The framework that produced him cannot fully be held responsible for the choices he made within the conditions the framework had produced. The choices he made cannot fully be assessed without acknowledging the conditions the framework had imposed. Both responsibilities are real. Neither cancels the other. The figure who emerges from the cumulative examination is the complicated figure that the title of this documentary has identified. A figure whose pattern of documented adult conduct produces the framing the title has used while operating within the institutional context that complicates any simple application of that framing. The title's specific phrase about Kensington Palace burying every word has applied, in its most direct sense, to the William altercation we examined in Part 7. Kensington Palace had produced no public acknowledgement of the alleged 2019 incident. The institutional silence had been substantial. The silence had been broken by Harry's own publication in 2023. The palace's continuing silence after the publication had been the framework's standard response to allegations the institution had decided not to substantively address. The burial had been institutional. The burial had been broken. The contents of what had been buried had become, through Harry's disclosures, part of the documentary record. The institutional silence continues. The information is now public regardless of the silence. This is, in the end, the structural fact about Harry's institutional position as of 2026. The framework that had organized his life had produced him. The framework had attempted to manage him. The framework had eventually failed to absorb the cumulative effect of his particular character, his marriage to Meghan, and the various institutional pressures that the modern conditions of senior royal life had produced. The failure had produced the rupture of 2020. The rupture had produced the cumulative public disclosures that the years since 2020 have generated. The disclosures had produced the documentary record that this documentary has been examining. The man who has emerged on the other side of the rupture is a man whose institutional position has been substantially attenuated but whose public visibility has not. He continues to produce the media projects, the legal proceedings, the various public engagements that have constituted his post-royal professional life. He continues to be one of the most documented figures of his generation. He continues to be the subject of the kind of sustained institutional and public examination that few private citizens absorb across decades of their adult lives. The closing meditation that this documentary has been working toward is the meditation on what the cumulative examination has revealed. The pattern of his documented conduct is the pattern. The framework that produced him is the framework. The choices he made within the framework were his choices. The institutional inadequacies that had failed him were the institution's inadequacies. The marriage to Meghan was the institutional moment that broke the framework's capacity to continue managing him. The post-rupture life he has constructed in California is the life he has chosen. The relationship with his birth family is the relationship he has been able to maintain. Partial, attenuated, complicated by the cumulative effects of the disclosures he has produced. Both pictures of Harry are real. The boy whose mother died when he was 12 and whose grief was not institutionally addressed is real. The man who used the racial slur, who chose the Nazi uniform, who was photographed naked in Vegas, who described killing 25 Taliban as removing chess pieces from a board, who alleged his brother had assaulted him at Nottingham Cottage and then made the allegation public in a globally distributed memoir. This man is also real. They are the same person. The framework had produced both. The choices that produced the second picture had been the choices made by the figure who had been formed by the conditions of the first picture. The complications are real. The historical record now holds both. The framework continues. The institution continues. King Charles continues his reign. William continues as Prince of Wales, preparing for the eventual succession that his birth had organized for him. The framework's traditional mechanisms continue to operate in modified forms around the senior royals who remain inside the institution. Harry continues, in California, the post-royal life that the rupture has produced. The two trajectories, the institutional and the post-institutional, continue in parallel. The framework had not been able to fully retain him. The framework has not, however, fully released him either. The complicated middle position he occupies is the position he has been occupying for the period since 2020. What happens next has not yet been written. The relationship with King Charles continues to evolve in ways that may, depending on the trajectory of the king's health and the various other institutional factors, produce additional moments of attempted reconciliation. The relationship with William has shown no available indication of being modifiable in any sustained sense. The legal proceedings against the British tabloids continue to produce additional outcomes. The various media projects produced by Harry and Meghan continue to be developed. The two children continue to grow up in California, registering the realities of their lives without yet being old enough to produce their own institutional engagement with the questions that their parents' positions have raised. The historical record will continue to develop. The pattern this documentary has examined will be modified in various dimensions by the events that the years ahead will produce. The structural analysis we have conducted across the 8 parts of this documentary will be refined in various places by the additional disclosures and reassessments that future biographical examinations of Harry's life will produce. What the analysis has established, however, is the cumulative pattern as it stands at the end of 2025. The pattern is the pattern. The figure who has produced the pattern is the figure he is. The complications are real. He had been the spare. He had been the boy who walked behind his mother's coffin. He had been the figure whose documented adult conduct produced the cumulative pattern this documentary has examined. He had been the husband whose marriage produced the institutional rupture with the family of his birth. He had been the father whose 2 children are being raised in California outside the institution he was raised inside. He had been the figure whose legal proceedings have produced the institutional accountability of the British tabloid press for conduct that had been operating across decades. He had been all of these. He continues to be all of these. The figure who has emerged from the cumulative examination of his life is the figure he has been across his decades in the various conditions that his life has imposed. The institution that produced him produced what it produced. The choices he made within the institution were the choices he made. The historical record now holds both. That is the story this documentary has been about. That is the figure Harry has been. That is the pattern the documentary record now contains. That is what the cumulative examination of his life has revealed. The framework continues. The institution continues. Harry continues. In California, the life he has constructed. Both pictures are him. Both are real. The history will hold what the history has now made visible. That is the complete story. That is what the cumulative examination has produced. That is the figure Prince Harry has been, across the long arc of his 5 decades, in the conditions his birth and his choices and the institutional framework that surrounded him had together imposed. Thanks for watching the full documentary. If you like this type of documentary, then please stay with us by subscribing to our channel.